The man sighed heavily and informed the young and beautiful lady that she only had 6 months left to live. She looked away at him, but he only looked away sadly. At that very moment, she sighed heavily, as she had already accepted her fate. She had already foreseen this from the moment she got married, for the young man who was known as a nightmare on the battlefield. But until now, she had never felt regret. However, even with that state of affairs, she just wanted to see Cardi. A vivid memory of her childhood was the piercing, contemptuous eyes of her father, Duke Littenheim. He despised her because she had the blood of a servant in her veins, and she was still no good. He regretted that she had not died with her mother. At the same time, she heard the mocking voices of the maids because they said that they were in the same position and had to work hard for a piece of bread. As an illegitimate child abandoned and alone in the Duke's residence, she had to adapt to survive. Ironically, the man who saved her was her half-brother Ernan. Ernan, looking at the servants, said that they should treat his sister as a member of the ducal family. He knew it was unusual for them, but the Duke had passed away, and if they wanted to keep their place, they had to follow the rules. They were in shock. When she was 15 years old, the Duke died in an accident, and the first thing her brother did after taking up the position was to announce it to the family members. At that time, he recognized her as his younger sister. Syria was shocked because she didn't expect this. She heard the whispers of the maids because they knew that the girl was an illegitimate child. Syria understood perfectly well that it was even pitiful to look at her. She didn't know whether she would become the Duke's daughter. She understood that she could be thrown out, considered useless, and like her mother, she understood that she needed her brother's help. She recalled the words of her father, who always insisted that she was a stain on their reputation and their family. She understood perfectly well that if she didn't take a step forward, she would be thrown out again. But she didn't know how to do something like that because she was always ridiculed and despised. When she was at social receptions, she was always discussed because despite her awkward origins, she looked beautiful. At that very moment, she understood everything because the only way to avoid being thrown out by the Duke was to enter into a political marriage. Sometime later, the young lady came to meet the Crown Prince himself and the Grand Duke. The young man looked at her intently and introduced himself and also asked her to call him Cardi Esperand. She looked at him with relief as she didn't think he was upset by the maid's daughter's marriage proposal. They drank tea in silence for a while after the awkward greeting. Cardi, while drinking tea, looked intently at the young lady, not approving of her glance. She was confused by his gaze as she saw that he was like a work of art itself. Although he looked at her rather suspiciously, she was taken aback when she saw him sigh heavily. Cardi smiled and said he didn't think the lady knew what kind of person he was yet. He looked at her with a smirk and asked if she really wanted to become the wife of a monster like him. He asked her if she wanted to become the monster's wife. A nightmare on the battlefield, a transcendent power rare in Rhea's maternal lineage. Just one such force is enough to determine the course of a war, but its price is great, and in exchange it takes the life of its owner. Everyone said that the young man would not live to be 30 and would die young. She said that she knew very well about his strength. He smiled and asked if she still wanted to marry him. At that very moment, her young lady nodded firmly, showing him her intentions. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he had not expected anything like this. Cardi sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, asked her to think about it again. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was worried about her. Syria looked at the young man with admiration, as she had never met anyone like him before. He sighed heavily and said that he was not worthy of being near her. But at that very moment, the young lady did not let him finish, and said with a smile that everything was fine. She said that she didn't need time to think about it at all. She in turn felt guilty about this proposal. She knew that Cardi was important to the empire, and the emperor knew that if the Duke's daughter took the role of consort, he would hand over the Littenheim iron mines to the Duke. She looked at him intently and said softly that she was also a person who was not worthy of being with someone. A partner can share the burden of Cardi's power. After all, every time the owner uses power, the partner also loses some of his power, thanks to which the owner could live a little longer. The emperor told the young lady that this agreement was a secret that only he and she knew about, so no one should know about the secret. She knew that all was well because everyone was in the black, since the Duke was to receive the rights to the iron mines, and that was quite enough. The young man looked at the young lady intently, as he could not imagine that she would be his wife. After all, he knew that everyone who was dear to him had already left him. His mother had committed suicide, and the imperial family was simply trying to use him for power, which he couldn't even control, so he didn't know if he should take such a step. Looking at the beautiful lady, he sighed heavily and said that she would definitely regret this decision. She looked at him with a smile, because she knew that everything was okay, and she was already used to regrets. Since the title of Archduke was a combination of prince and duke, the wedding ceremony was considered only a small event. In a way, it was natural that a duke's daughter would be of mixed blood like her. She married a man who was called a monster. Everyone watched them closely during the ceremony. Ernan in turn looked at her tenderly, as he hoped that they would be happy. The young lady looked at her brother with a smile, as she was grateful to him. The married life of the young and beautiful lady was peaceful. They often ate together. We also didn't forget about walking together in the beautiful garden. They were together throughout the day and even often went out into the city for a walk. In the evenings, they also happily spent time with each other. Those who knew nothing about love became accustomed to each other's warmth before they realized it themselves. Cardi looked at his wife with a smile and told her that today was their first anniversary. The young lady was taken aback and smiled as she did not expect that so much time had passed. The young man looked at her sheepishly and said that it was so and so. He had prepared a small gift for her. Syria was shocked by this gift, as it gave her an entire garden of daffodils. He looked at her tenderly and said that she had once told him earlier that she loved these flowers. The young lady was shocked because she saw that her husband would remember even what she had said in passing in the summer. She was taken aback and said that unfortunately, she had not prepared any gift for him. But he said with a smile that everything was fine and she did not need to be upset. He looked away from her embarrassed as he wanted to offer something in return. At that very moment, the young man reached out to his wife and asked if he could hold her hand. Syria froze for a moment and looked at him with embarrassment. She was puzzled because she realized that she had unwittingly fallen in love with him. She loved him very much, but their tenderness did not last long. The worried maid asked if she should send a messenger to the master. Syria sighed heavily and said that this should not be done, but the maid had a different opinion and knew that the mistress did not have much time left. Syria sighed heavily and said that her husband was risking his life on the battlefield, and she could not disturb him. While the emperor had his powerful, wise, and handsome son under control, he could not refuse the benefits of possessing the power of Cardi. That's why he constantly sent him to the battlefield without a break. So the Archduke faced the leader of the barbarians one-on-one. He managed to subjugate the northern magicians. The young man grew as the emperor's hatred towards him grew as he kept him under control. The reason he continued to follow the emperor's orders, despite the hatred and close supervision, was because he had a weakness. The emperor looked at the young man with a satisfied grin and congratulated him for his hard work, and also said that he should convey his warmest greetings to his wife. Syria understood perfectly well that her husband should not know about her condition for her sake, for the good of their marriage, since he was always on the front lines. But she was very puzzled because she wanted to see him before she left the world. At that moment, she was taken aback and turned around, throwing all her thoughts away as she heard the voice of her husband. A moment later, she looked at her husband in surprise. She didn't understand why he returned so early, but he didn't answer. He just looked at her with tears in his eyes. At that very moment, the young lady stumbled and fell into the arms of her husband. He angrily asked why she did this. Syria flinched, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at his wife intently and said that he had always been surprised because he had heard that he would not be able to borrow until he was 30, but he was still alive. He sighed heavily and said that, however, he did not understand the reason, because there was a method called return. She did not understand how he knew such a thing. He angrily asked why she had to pay for what he had done when she had done it to save his life. He screamed that he had no idea that she was sacrificing her life for him, because all this time he believed that he was protecting her. Cardi immediately fell to the ground with a crash, as he was upset that she had been sacrificing her life for him all this time. The young lady tenderly reached closer to him and calmed him down and stopped biting his lips. With tears in his eyes, he looked at her and asked if it really mattered now. She smiled tenderly at him and said that, of course, it was important, because she didn't want to see him hurt himself. Syria looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was all because of Togo that she loved him very much. She hugged him tightly and said that she knew perfectly well that he was not a monster at all. For this reason, she wanted to protect him. Bursting into tears, he shouted at her as if he didn't understand why she was doing such a thing. But she only repeated that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Syria smiled and asked if he minded. He sighed heavily and said that she was still heartless. After all, she knew perfectly well that he was not able to leave her. She was glad that he didn't blame her for this situation, She didn't know when she had fallen in love with him, but she understood that she couldn't describe this feeling in words. She only quietly thanked him for their time together. However, it was impossible to turn back time, and unfortunately, her condition only worsened. Cardi looked closely at his wife and asked if she needed anything. She looked at him tenderly and said that he was very tired and should rest, but he insisted that he was fine and that she didn't need to worry. Syria knew he had been saying that a lot lately. Syria looked at him with a gentle smile and called out. At that very moment, she sat up and with a playful smile asked if he would like to share the bed with her. Cardi was taken aback and froze for a moment, as he did not expect such a question. The lady said with a smile that she was asking because she knew he would not go to bed, and it had been a long time since they had slept together. Cardi sighed heavily, but still agreed. Syria hugged her husband tightly, as she felt comfortable lying with him on the same bed. He looked at his wife with sadness and longing, as he saw that she had lost weight. At that very moment, she looked at him tenderly and said that she never regretted becoming his partner. She smiled and asked him not to regret it either. Syria said with a satisfied smile that she was serious about everything because she was truly happy that she could do at least something for him. She sighed heavily and said that if she couldn't do that, she could lose him. She said with a smile that death is not as bad as it seems, but to her regret, she knew she couldn't be honest with him. He hugged her tightly and with tears in his eyes, asked her not to say such a thing because he was not ready to say goodbye to her. Cardi in tears said he was afraid to let her close to him because everyone he loved was dying. He said she was completely different. The young lady pulled her husband closer to her and said with a smile that she wanted to tell him something. She looked at him tenderly and said that the happiest time in her life had been the last 10 years she had spent with him. She remembered all their wonderful moments with tenderness. So with a tender smile, she asked him to smile at her too, one last time. Syria looked at her husband and said with a smile that in the last moments of her life, she would like to see only his smile. At that very moment, she hugged her beloved husband tightly and told him that she loved him very much. She was grateful that he was next to her. The next day, the young man slowly opened his eyes. At that very moment, he looked at his wife and called her, but unfortunately, he received no answer. He reached closer to her and hugged her. At that very moment, he realized that he had lost her forever. After some time, the young lady opened her eyes and froze for a moment. The maid casually told the girl that she didn't know she was still in bed. She looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she had swept the hallway only a couple of months ago. The maid looked at the girl with hatred and asked if she really thought she was a real lady. Syria froze in shock, not understanding what she was doing in the Duke's castle. At that very moment, she turned her gaze in surprise to a small brooch. She remembered that the maid had deliberately broken this gift before their wedding. They mockingly said that it was a very bad omen for the bride. Syria reached for the small brooch and a moment later hugged it tightly. She wondered if she had gone back in time to a day when she and her husband did not know each other. The young lady in turn was very shocked. She could not believe that she had simply returned to the past. She was stunned because she realized that all his memories with her husband had disappeared. But she knew that since she had the chance to return to the past, she already knew what she would do next. She wanted to see her husband again and touch him. The maid looked at the young lady with disdain and called her. A few seconds later, she said that the Duke was already waiting for her. At that very moment, she casually asked the girl how long she intended to stay in bed. Syria knew very well that her past self would not have objected. She remembered how she was treated with disdain. Syria spoke to the maid modestly and shyly. The young man watched everything that was happening closely. A moment later, he called her. She was taken aback and froze for a moment. But even he asked why she didn't think of herself as someone special. She was taken aback and started to apologize, but he said that she shouldn't apologize for something like that. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want such a beautiful girl to be treated like that because she was important to him. The young lady was taken aback and asked shyly if she was really important to him. At that very moment, he firmly replied that of course it was so, and the lady in turn shuddered and beamed with happiness. He looked at her intently and said with embarrassment that she was his wife and the most important person in his life. Syria froze in place for a moment in embarrassment. Syria recalled how he had spoken tenderly of her as being special to him. Therefore, she had no intention of allowing the servants to treat her disdainfully. At that very moment, the maid looked at her with contempt and told her to hurry as the Duke wanted to see her right away. The young lady knew that she would no longer humiliate herself. She asked the maid angrily how she dared to speak to her like that. Looking at the maid, she asked her name. The maid was taken aback as she saw that something had changed in the young lady. Trembling with fear, she called the young lady by name. Syria looked at the maid with a satisfied smile and said that everything was correct because she was the Duke's only daughter. Syria asked the maid with a smirk if she didn't think she was treating her inappropriately. At that very moment, she smiled tenderly and asked if she had ever allowed anyone to speak to her in a condescending manner. She looked at the maid with a snowy smile and announced that she was fired. The maid was taken aback and frightened. She looked at her mistress and screamed and asked for forgiveness, but it was all in vain. Syria sighed heavily, knowing she didn't have time to deal with the maids. At that very moment, she looked in the mirror at her beautiful reflection and froze. She saw beautiful blonde hair, pink cheeks. She understood that she was still full of strength and energy. Then the young lady clearly realized that she had indeed returned to the past, but she did not know why she had returned to this particular time. But she knew one thing for sure: she had a chance to change the future. She didn't think that her health problems would start right away, and weddings would start. Syria assumed it all happened towards the end of the first year, when her health began to deteriorate. She didn't know what had changed, but she remembered the great conquest of Reyes, motherland of Cardi, Empress of Veronica. He thought about conquering his mother's country after she committed suicide. Reyes was well aware of the fact that she still had 10 years left, and she wanted to find a way to be with the Duke. She knew perfectly well what she had to do to achieve this. But when the young lady opened her closet, she froze in place as she had no memory of what she was wearing. But after a few seconds, a brilliant idea came to his head because she couldn't keep him waiting for long. She understood perfectly well that in order to meet the Duke, she needed to enlist the support of her half-brother. Sometime later, after much preparation, the young lady finally came to her brother. She knocked softly, and he looked at the door in bewilderment. A moment later, she told him who had come to see him and asked if he wanted to see her. He sighed heavily and said that she could come in to him. A moment later, the young lady also leisurely entered her brother's office. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and looked at her in bewilderment as he did not understand what she was wearing. The young lady stood still for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She knew it was all because he had given her a name. And besides, this is the first and last time he wanted to see her now and in the future. Ernan looked at her intently and called her name again because he wanted to get an answer to the question. She really wanted to tell him these words, but she knew that it was impossible. Instead of pointing them out, it would be better to gain his sympathy. At the same moment, she said that it was all because her mother was a maid. Ernan asked with bewilderment what this had to do with her outfit. She said that it was all because it was the only way to win the favor of the maids, since everyone thought that he had accepted her into the family, only to save face. She also reported that he didn't even want to see her anymore. Syria looked at her brother, smiled tenderly, and said that she understood everything, and that these were just stories. Syria said she knew he wanted her to become independent, not because he had simply forgotten about her. The young man sighed heavily, because he knew that she was absolutely right. It had been 5 years since their father had passed away, and he hadn't even thought about his sister. Syria sighed heavily, and said that she couldn't help the fact that her mother was a maid. He said she shouldn't be treated like that. The young lady froze for a moment, as he surprisingly responded positively. At that very moment, she thanked him, but he said that he would like to talk to her about something. Ernan asked his sister if she would go to the debutante ball. He wanted to know if she had a partner. She smiled and said she would attend it this spring, but she was surprised that he remembered. At that moment, the young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer about her partner. Ernan looked at her intently, waiting for an answer. She in turn wanted to ask Cardi to become her partner, but unfortunately, she has not met him yet. She couldn't just show up at him and yell that he should be her partner, because she knew he wasn't a monster. Syria knew perfectly well that he would think she was simply crazy. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and said that she didn't have a partner. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't received any invitations at all. She sighed heavily as she knew there were several invitations. But in reality, there were a ton of them. Since the Duke was the most powerful man, she was just a servant and could have become an attractive trophy. In the past, she chose someone at random, and to her regret, she deeply regretted it. Syria sighed heavily and decided to throw all her thoughts away. At that very moment, she looked at her brother and asked if he could become her partner. She knew that if he came with her as her partner, she would no longer be looked upon as a servant. She knew that he would refuse her, but she understood that she had nothing to lose. At that very moment, the Duke agreed. She understood that he would refuse, and said with a smile that she knew how busy he was. But he also said that he would go with her. Ernan sighed heavily and said that it was not unusual for a father or brother to be partners at a ball. He asked her to find a suitable outfit and also informed her that she didn't need to worry about the price. She froze in shock on the spot. Ernan looked closely at his sister and asked if she really wanted to say something. She was taken aback as she was simply speechless. But as she was leaving, she still stopped and told her brother that she had fired the maid that morning. Without looking up at his sister, he agreed with her. Syria froze at the door, shocked by everything that was happening. At this time, the young duke was distracted from his work and thought for a moment about his sister. She had seemed more depressed to him before, but now he felt some changes in her. Ernan in turn did not know what changes she was hiding within herself, but he understood that it was even for the better. After some time, she met with the maids and said that she would like to attend the debutante ball, so she needed an outfit. She knew she needed to be perfectly prepared for everything because she wanted to meet his husband, but unfortunately, she knew nothing about tailors. And looking at the maids, she asked them to recommend her a good tailor, since they knew a lot about this. They looked at her in surprise, but at that very moment, she smiled radiantly at them and said that she would be grateful for their help. Syria remembered her beloved with tenderness, because in this life, she wanted to help people. She wanted to be his support when he needed her. That's why she wanted to become independent in this life. At that very moment, she said with a smile that she needed an unusually special dress. A debutante ball is the first opportunity for young noble ladies and gentlemen to make their debut before they become adults, so it is considered an important event. And she also met her husband for the first time at the ball. Syria always wondered why such a wonderful man like him didn't have a partner. She could clearly see that he was very handsome, but she knew that the nightmare of the battlefield was his nickname. In the past, she hadn't had the courage to talk to him and had simply passed him by. Sometime later, the young lady firmly refused her maids when they presented her with various outfits. She said that all the outfits were not bad, but they were not good enough. The maids were puzzled, but they also knew that the Duke would accompany her on the buns partner, so they were sure that she wanted to get the best outfit. But the young lady refused them every time because she liked the fabric, but did not like the design or vice versa. Syria criticized each outfit because she wanted to find the best one of all. She was puzzled because she thought that she would get what she wanted, but for several days, no one could find a suitable dress. Looking at the maids, she said that she had a very clear definition of reward and punishment. Syria looked at everyone present with a smile and asked them to come closer to her. At that very moment, she extended her hand to the maid because she intended to give them a few gold coins each time for the work done. The maids were shocked by everything that was happening because nothing like this had happened before. The maid was taken aback as she did not understand what they were getting money for, since they could not find a suitable dress for the young lady. Syria smiled and said that they never found the outfit, but each of them tried for her, so they should get a reward. Her young maids froze in place in surprise, as they were touched by her words. They looked at her with a smile and thanked her at the same moment. In fact, she knew a lot about tailors. After all, being the wife of the Archduke for many years. Of course, she knew about them, since noble ladies spent most of their money on updating their wardrobe. The maids were taken aback, and looking at their mistress, said that they assumed she wanted to fire them. Syria wanted them to understand that they would be rewarded and punished. She informed them that she would leave the castle after the wedding, so she would not interfere in their personal affairs. Looking at the maids, she said that they should not cross the line and go against the lady of the castle. At that very moment, the young servant came out to her mistress and called her. Syria sighed heavily and timidly said that she had actually found a studio, but she had only been able to get a sample. At that very moment, the young lady saw daffodils embroidered on the fabric and warmly remembered her beloved. Syria smiled and told the maid that she would choose this particular tailor. Syria looked at the maid and said that from now on, she would be her personal maid. Sophie cried out in embarrassment that it was a great honor for her. The young lady smiled and congratulated her new maid. She was surprised that this did not bring back memories of her beloved, but she knew that this tailor was just the man she needed, as he would soon become famous. She was pleased because she knew that she was almost ready for the upcoming event, and hoped that her beloved would wait for her. Ernan looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if his sister had really said that she would leave the castle after the wedding and therefore would not interfere in other people's personal affairs. The young man firmly said that everything was exactly like that because he heard it with his own ears. Ernan was taken aback for a moment, as it seemed to him that his sister had suddenly grown up a lot. After some time, they arrived at the castle in the city. The debutante ball was held annually in March. People stayed at the Duke's mansion and prepared for the ball. She was happy because she knew that she would soon be able to meet her beloved. She was very excited and decided to calm down a little after she remembered that she would meet him young. And at that very moment, she caught her brother's gaze. Syria timidly asked her brother if he really wanted to tell her something. He looked at her intently for a moment, but said nothing. A moment later, he turned away from her and said that he didn't want to tell her anything. She smiled tenderly and said that he could say it and he didn't need to be shy. The young Duke sighed heavily as he agreed with her. But at that very moment, the servants greeted them. She looked at her brother in bewilderment as she did not understand what was going on at all. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was in a depressed state. The young man looked at them with a smile and said that they would do everything possible to make their stay comfortable. Syria immediately said with a smile that she would stay in the mansion for a short time after the ball. The young Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why she intended to stay in the mansion and wanted to know what she meant. She smiled and said that it was because there would be social events after the ball, and she wanted to stay and meet new people. She smiled and told her brother that she needed to prepare for marriage, and asked if he was thinking about it. The Duke sighed heavily and told his sister that he had heard that she wanted to leave the castle soon. She smiled and said that it was true, because she couldn't stay with him forever. Syria smiled and asked her brother if they should talk outside, since it was already cold. Looking at his sister, he said that she was right, and a moment later, they walked inside. Ernan looked at his sister, sighed heavily, and said that he was very sorry. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that if he had known that she would leave the castle so soon, he would have behaved better with her. She froze for a moment, not expecting to hear something like that. She wondered if the reason he was so depressed was because she had to leave the castle. Syria looked at her brother with a gentle smile and said that he could treat her better right now. The maids looked at their masters in bewilderment. They did not know whether they had always been so close. After all, they always thought that the Duke didn't care about his sister. But they also noticed that something had changed in the young lady. Sometime later, the long-awaited day of the debutantes arrived. The Duke looked closely at his sister, as he noticed that she looked absolutely beautiful today. The young lady thanked her brother with a smile for such a wonderful compliment. She was a little surprised, because she had never seen him like this before. Syria realized that she too had always put up a big wall around him. She knew that he was a fair but strict man, and because of this, she was very afraid of him. She realized that if he didn't care, he wouldn't have saved her, and she also learned that he could smile more often. And he tried to be a good brother to her. She hoped that he would continue to change little things in the future. After all, then she will be able to prevent her sad future. She knew that she could meet her lover at the ball today. Syria knew perfectly well that this would be more than enough for her. Sometime later, the young man announced the arrival of the Duke and his sister. The young people slowly entered the hall, and everyone looked at them in surprise. The young ladies were surprised and could not believe that the Duke was accompanying the young lady. The young people did not know that they could see the Duke himself at such a celebration. After all, everyone had heard before that he didn't care about his sister. But everyone looked with admiration at her beautiful outfit, because ladies did not wear colorful outfits to the ball. But looking at the girl, everyone saw that she was very sophisticated. Everyone judged by the outfit and noticed how much the Duke cared for his sister. At the same time, the young lady was looking around the room intently as she was looking for her lover. At that very moment, a young lady approached her. Syria looked intently at Baroness Tess and greeted her. The Baroness was surprised that the young lady knew her. After some time, everyone surrounded the young lady and began to introduce themselves one by one. Syria looked at everyone present with a smile as she saw that this time everything was different. Syria asked for forgiveness as she wanted to leave in order to be able to meet her lover. But at that very moment, the Baroness asked, "What about the Princes Odalita and Nortenbert?" She wanted to know whether they had arrived or not. At that very moment, everyone saw with concern that Marcus Nortenbert had already arrived at the ball, but he had no partner. Syria looked at the girls with tears in her eyes as she wanted to know about a completely different prince. At that very moment, they said that the emperor wanted to hand over the throne to Marcus because there were frightening rumors about another prince. She looked intently at all the ladies present, who were discussing her lover and his strength as well as the late empress. She smiled tenderly and said that they were talking about the influential people of the empire, as if they had come only to spread gossip. She asked why on earth they thought they could talk about them. In such a way, the ladies were taken aback and said that they didn't mean it at all. At that very moment, she told everyone that the imperial leadership was not taking this as a joke and that they should not speak about them in such a way. Looking at everyone present, she firmly said that Prince Odalite was the only one who would take the throne. She also said that they should not spread any more gossip about the young prince. At the same time, the prince looked closely at the young ladies. He was surprised because the young lady was very angry when she said such words. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as she was informed that the young prince had not yet arrived. She was worried because she didn't know when she would be able to see her lover. She was as upset as she had hoped to see her lover. Marcus, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smile. Previously, it seemed to him that she was no different from others. Ernan looked closely at his sister and called her. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and told his sister that they should open this point. She was surprised, looked at him, but still agreed. The opportunity to dance the first dance to the herald of the opening of the ball is a great honor for high-ranking aristocrats. At the same time, the young lady enjoyed a wonderful dance, as she had not had the chance to dance with him in the past. Syria stared at her handsome and tall brother, who was dancing with her. She knew that in the past, the person who had been awarded the right to open the ball was none other than Marcus. Ernan looked at his sister with a tender smile, as he didn't know that she could dance. She was surprised that he didn't know anything like that, but he rushed off and said that he simply hadn't had the opportunity to dance with her. She smiled and said that it was because he was always busy. When she called him, Duke Ernan froze for a moment, and his smile faded. He was puzzled and did not understand why she continued to call him Duke. He sighed heavily, as he believed that he had no need to complain, since he had failed to be a good brother to her. At the same time, the young people were closely watched by the guests, as they looked very happy. Littenheim, the richest and oldest of all three lords. Everyone was wondering who she would marry if he really cared about his sister. They knew that such a person would receive strong support from the south. And besides, the young man noticed that the young lady was very beautiful. At that very moment, he looked at his companion with a smile as he had become carried away. The Duke looked at his sister closely and said that he was very sorry because he wanted to stay longer, but business called him. She said with a smile that everything was fine and he didn't need to worry, as she would go away and rest a bit while he waited for him. The young lady, in turn, knew that everything was going well. She saw that she had a chance to go in search of her lover. Syria knew perfectly well that he had to be outside, because he would feel uncomfortable inside. At that very moment, the young lady froze in place as she heard a familiar voice. The young man came closer to the young lady and called her with a grin. She hesitantly stepped back from the young man, as she knew very well who was next to her. He looked at her with a smile, as if he noticed that she looked beautiful today. Syria knew very well that in her past life, the young man had tried to do something nasty to her. She looked closely at her young companion and said that he was too drunk, so she asked him to go inside. He reached out to her and grabbed her hand and told her that he had met a beautiful lady under the moonlight. At that very moment, he came closer to her as he wanted to kiss her beautiful hand. But the young lady looked at her companion with disgust, and at that very moment, she quickly took her hand back and shouted for him to stop. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. But at the same moment, he shouted angrily that she was heartless because he tried and cared for her. Syria shouted that she had not asked him to do this, and noted that he had just insulted a lady from a respectable family. The young man was shouting furiously at the young lady, and the young duke became an involuntary witness to this situation. The young man was furious and shouted that she should have refused her brother and accepted his proposal. He shouted that she had insulted his sincere feelings. He shouted with fury that she must immediately pay him for insulting him. Syria angrily asked what he was even talking about, since she didn't owe him anything. He looked at her with a smirk and said that a kiss would do for payment. Looking at the young lady, he said with a fierce grin that only in this case would she be forgiven. She was taken aback as she realized that it would not be possible to come to an agreement with him. Mocking his companion, he said that in that case they would sort everything out and all the misunderstandings would disappear. She was very worried because she did not know what to do, and at that very moment, she decided to call someone for help. But a moment later, she froze in place as she heard a painfully familiar voice. The Duke looked at the young man intently and said that the young lady had already refused him. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that the lady had clearly told him that she did not want such a thing. At the same time, the young lady looked at her lover with admiration and embarrassment. She saw her lover whom she had missed for a long time. Syria, looking at her, beloved involuntarily, called out his name. But at the same moment, the young man shouted angrily at the Duke as he wanted him to immediately get out of their way because he did not know who he really was. he shouted at the Duke and asked him angrily who he was. He was furious and continued to shout and vent his anger on the Grand Duke. At that very moment, the young man shouted that he, the lord close to the Count, and therefore he must get out of the way. The young lady froze for a moment, as she knew her lover did not show himself at one public event. For this reason, a small circle of people could recognize him. Cardi looked at the young man with cold fury as he noticed that he constantly mentioned his connection with the Count. At that very moment, the young man was taken aback and asked his opponent what he was even talking about. Cardi sighed heavily and told the young man that he would spare him this time, and since he determined people's worth based on their status, he also intended to play along. The young man was furious. He didn't understand what his companion was talking about. Cardi looked at the young man and said that Dota had insulted the young lady, who belongs to one of the 3 influential families. He also insulted the crown prince, and he did not show any respect to Prince Odolite. The young man froze for a moment when he heard something like this. He was taken aback because he knew that his opponent was now talking about the nightmare of the battlefield, and at the same time about the monster of the empire. Cardi immediately looked intently at the young man and asked what he was going to do. Syria looked at them intently as she saw that the young man looked like a frightened rat that was trembling before the formidable lion. The young man immediately turned his gaze to the young lady and asked why she was standing there and just watching since she was obliged to help him. The young lady was shocked by his words and did not understand why she should help him. At that very moment, he shouted that it was all because he would soon become the next lord. He did not understand how she could be so cold-blooded. While saying such words, he reached out to her, but the Archduke intercepted his hand. He looked at the young man intently and menacingly, and he in turn shouted with rage that he should be released immediately. But the Archduke had no intention of doing anything of the sort. He pushed the young man away, and he fell to the ground with a crash. A moment later, he said that judging by what he had done to him and the lady, this was still a mild punishment. Cardi looked at the young man with disdain as he noticed that he was too noisy, and he assumed that even pigs in a slaughterhouse did not scream like he was now. The young lady was fascinated by her lover as she saw his cold and calm voice. She knew that this is exactly how he was when they first met. Then he asked in a cold voice, with a gentle smile, if she really wanted to become the wife of a monster like him. She knew he could be very cold-blooded and cruel to others and to himself, but at the same time, he was very considerate to strangers. She knew he was still the same. At that very moment, the young man turned around and asked the young lady if she was okay. Since he noticed that she looked very scared, she was taken aback by the smile and looked at him. Cardi moved closer to his companion and asked if she could go. Syria froze and looked at him with embarrassment, but a moment later, she rushed towards the young man and, grabbing his hand, thanked him. Syria stared at the Archduke as she loved him more than life itself, and so she had no intention of moving even an inch. He looked at her with bewilderment as she clung to his hand and did not want to let go. Cardi stood there for a moment, stunned, as if he were embarrassed by the whole thing. At that very moment, he took off his cape and threw it over the young lady's shoulders. Syria was embarrassed, but still said that he might freeze without a cape. Cardi sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry, and also added that she would return the cape when they went inside the castle. He sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to go back. Syria walked slowly to the castle with her lover. She didn't know what to do. Her heart was pounding wildly, and she was worried that he might hear. But the young lady could not do anything about her heart, as she missed her beloved very much and was glad to see him again. A moment later, the young ladies were taken aback and looked at the young men with their mouths open. The men in turn froze in place and looked at the beautiful couple in surprise. Everyone was very surprised, and at the same time puzzled, as they saw that the prince himself gave the young lady his cape. A moment later, the young lady bowed and thanked her companion for leading her and giving her a cloak, while everyone looked at them sideways and whispered. Cardi, looking at the young lady, the lady said that she should not worry about anything. She thought for a moment, because she knew that she needed to come up with an urgent reason to meet him. At that very moment, she said that she would return the cape to him after washing it. But Cardi, looking at the young lady, said that there was no need for that, and she could not worry about it. She sighed heavily as she knew that he had always been like that. At that very moment, he turned around, and as he was leaving, asked her to enjoy the ball. She was in shock and unable to bear it, shouted at him to stop. He didn't do it, and she immediately screamed his name. Everyone froze in shock and began to look at the young lady in surprise. At the same time, the great Archduke looked at the young lady with no less surprise. She froze for a moment in shock and embarrassment as she heard everyone whispering because she had called the prince by name in public. She hastily asked for forgiveness and bowed her head, but he came closer to her and said that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry. But still, the young prince with the cold look asked why she called him by name. Syria hesitated, not knowing what to answer him. Syria looked away from the prince and timidly said what she meant. He most likely knows the rules of the debutante ball. At the same time, the young prince looked at her intently, giving her time to say everything she wanted. She looked away from him as she was very embarrassed and puzzled and muttered something incoherently. The debutante was supposed to dance at least one dance because that was the rule of the debutante ball. If he did not dance, then people would consider the prince a stray. She did not want to allow him to be treated like that. He sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she wasn't afraid of him. She froze for a moment and looked at him with confusion. Cardi. Looking at the young lady, he said that he had a strange power, because of which everyone in the area called him a monster. He was surprised by these words, but at that very moment, he bowed, looking at the young lady. A moment later, he smiled and asked if she would do him the honor of dancing with him. Syria beamed with joy, and with a satisfied smile, agreed to his proposal. A moment later, they were whirling around in a beautiful dance. She saw that her lover had a calm expression on his face. Syria was puzzled at the same time, because she didn't understand why her heart was almost jumping out of her chest. She knew that she needed to calm down, because she didn't want to show him her feelings. Their first dance took place 3 years after their wedding, because then they had to attend a birthday party by order of the emperor. They had no desire to meet the emperor and the marquise, but they were forced to be there, and she felt exactly the same as he did now. The archduke looked closely at his companion and calmly asked what she was thinking about. She was taken aback because she knew she couldn't tell him everything. She would like to tell him about their family life in the past, but she understood that it was simply impossible, so she looked at him with a snowy smile. At that very moment, she said that she simply thought that he was really very handsome. Syria said with a radiant smile that his future wife, whoever she was, would be a truly lucky woman. The young man ran away for a moment, but did not answer. She froze for a moment and looked at us in surprise at his lover, and wondered if what she saw was true. She couldn't believe that her lover was embarrassed after her words. At that very moment, the archduke called her young lady. She looked at him intently, for his voice was sweeter than honey. Cardi immediately brought the young lady closer to him and whispered in her ear that she was incredibly beautiful. He looked at her tenderly and said with a smile that he was sincere in his words. Syria was taken aback and filled with embarrassment after his words. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness if these words might have seemed rude to her. She was taken aback and at the same moment asked if he had just laughed. He looked at her in surprise and asked if there was something wrong with it. The young lady in turn said that everything was fine. But looking at her lover, she said with a smile that she felt like she knew a little more about him. At that very moment, she said with a radiant smile that she was very happy about it. The archduke in turn froze for a moment in embarrassment as he felt feelings previously unknown to him. He was a little nervous and anxious as he knew that he had met the young lady for the first time today, but he had a strange feeling as if he had missed her for a very long time. He sighed heavily as he realized that this was just nonsense. He knew that he shouldn't ruin his relationship with his stupid thoughts. Syria looked at her companion with a tender smile and said that she did not know the composition very well, but thanks to him, she was able to complete the dance successfully. A moment later, the young man timidly removed his hand. She smiled and said that he didn't need to worry, as she was very glad that she had the chance to dance with him. A moment later, she bowed and thanked him for what he had done for her today. At that very moment, he looked at her in surprise. Syria said with a smile that she would like to have a cup of tea with him sometime. The young man bought something he didn't expect. He was a little puzzled, because I saw that everyone was looking at them with intent glances. He didn't understand why she was so nice to him. It seemed to him that there was no one more important to her than him. Syria looked intently at the young man and asked if such a thing was possible. Syria did not take her eyes off the archduke, as she knew that he did not like meaningless kind proposals. But a moment later, he smiled and said that he would gladly accept her offer. He smiled broadly and said that he would be happy to have tea with her. He didn't know why, but he couldn't refuse this offer. The young lady in turn beamed with happiness, as she knew that it was very good. A moment later, the duke approached his sister and called her. He looked sideways at the prince and asked if she had met the prince. She smiled and said that when she was on the street, she had met him by chance. At that very moment, the duke looked at his sister and asked about Shumak. She became angry as she was very angry with the young man, who was drunk, and behaved very ugly with her. The Duke looked closely at the prince, for he knew that his reputation was not up to par. He hoped that the prince had not been aggressive with his sister. Syria looked at her brother with a smile as she wanted to tell him everything. But at that very moment, the young man flew into the hall and called the Duke. He fell on his knees and began to beg the Duke to listen to him because of the young lady he had been seriously injured. The young man with tears in his eyes shouted that he had met a young lady and just wanted to say hello. The Duke looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked what he was even talking about, because if he only wanted to greet his sister, then there was no need for such a fuss. He did not understand what had happened to the young man's wrist. He looked closely at his sister and said that given her build, he didn't think she was capable of injuring anyone, much less a mature man. The young man bowed and shouted that he simply wanted to talk to the lady, and she responded by humiliating him. He shouted that the Archduke had intervened in their conversation and injured his hand. The Duke looked sideways at his sister and asked if his sister really treated him with contempt. He sighed heavily and said that if his sister had acted in such a way, then she really had a good reason for it. He looked at the young man with fury as he noticed that he reeked of alcohol. The young man was taken aback as he had no answer to these words. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and asked if he had really approached his sister in such a state. At that very moment, the Duke turned to his sister and asked her not to be shy and to tell the truth about what had really happened. The Duke wanted to know how the young man behaved around her. He wanted to know what really happened when the Archduke arrived. At that moment, the young lady looked at everyone present and said that she had recently refused the young man, but he continued to persist, and at the same time he kissed her hand. She said that the young man said that her refusal to become his partner at the ball was an insult to his family. Moreover, he began to insist that he would forgive her this offensive act if he forced himself to kiss her. Everyone looked at the young man with surprise and contempt, as they did not expect anything like this. After the words to his sister, the Duke looked at the young man with anger, as he did not know how to understand such a situation. At that moment, the young man was taken aback and shouted that it was a lie, and he had never done anything like that. The young man froze in shock as he saw everyone start whispering and humiliating him and looking at him with disdain. At the same time, the young lady turned around and looked at the Archduke with a tender smile. Then she said that the Archduke became her savior in this situation. Syria, looking at the young man, said that at that moment, he did not show an ounce of respect for the Archduke. When he was one of the great men of the empire, she looked at the young man with fury and anger and asked what he had said earlier. At that very moment, the Archduke repeated the young man's words, as he had earlier angrily asked him who he thought he was, and then he had shouted that it was none of his business and that he must leave immediately. The young man froze in place. He could not utter a word. The Duke sighed heavily as he understood that this was simply an absurd situation. He looked intently at everyone present and said that they could now safely sum up the situation and say that the young man had shown disrespect to his younger sister. In doing so, he humiliated the great lord of the empire, the eldest son of the imperial family, Archduke Odalith. He looked at the young man with fury and asked if this was really true. The young man, in turn, was taken aback and froze in shock as he could not utter a word. He did not understand why, because of this incident, the Archduke was not interested in his social receptions and was still in the banquet hall. He wondered if the Duke was really indifferent to his younger sister. At that very moment, the young lady said, looking at everyone present, that until today she had behaved inappropriately and allowed people to look down on her, but she had realized a lot. At that very moment, she said with a grin that nothing could be resolved if you just sat back and tolerated inappropriate treatment. Looking at all those present, she said that to insult her meant to insult the ducal family of which she was a member. Everyone froze for a moment at her words. Syria looked intently at everyone present and announced that the situation must be resolved immediately and all culprits punished. The Duke looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she would like to suggest a punishment. At that very moment, she said with a smile that she was ready to make one proposal. She said that, until now, as the Lord of the South Littenheim had given special privileges to the Schumacher family and other southern nobles, and to be precise, the wheat exported to them was half of its normal value. Their house was the richest in the empire, and it had taken possession of the largest granaries on the continent. There was enough wheat in the fertile lands to feed half the empire, allowing the southern nobles to enjoy a higher and more secure standard of living than others. She smiled a gentle smile and announced that her proposed punishment was to cut off the Schumacher family's wheat supply entirely. The young man was taken aback and asked the young lady to have mercy on him. At that very moment, the young lady came up to him. Jesus called with a smile. She smiled and asked if he really knelt before a half-breed aristocrat. She asked with a smile, "What about the honor and dignity of his family?" At that very moment, the Duke looked intently at the young man and announced that this was his punishment. He also shouted that the young man should not leave his sister's sight. Sometime after the banquet was over, the Duke thanked the Archduke for being his sister's savior and protecting hers. At that very moment, the Archduke said that everything was all right because it was his duty, and he also reported that the lady had already thanked him sufficiently. The Duke looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she had really thanked the Archduke. Before he could finish speaking, the young lady immediately told the Archduke with a joyful smile that in that case she would contact him soon. The Archduke looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said with a smile that he would look forward to her letter. The Duke looked at them in surprise as he did not understand what was going on at all. He looked at the young people with bewilderment because he saw that the atmosphere had changed a lot. He did not understand when they had become like this. For some time, the Archduke looked intently after the young lady, wishing her a good journey. Syria looked intently at her lover. At that very moment, the Duke called her. She looked at him with a smile. The Duke told his sister that it might have been her imagination, but the Archduke or any other man was very handsome. Before he could finish speaking, she asked with a joyful smile if it wasn't obvious. She said with shining eyes that the Archduke really reminded her of the graceful lion in some way, and she also said that she had heard before that he had practiced various types of martial arts and had ascended to the rank of Archduke with his own efforts. She spoke with admiration that he was incredibly handsome, and the Duke in turn realized that he was powerless against her words. Syria said with embarrassment that when she sees the Archduke butterflies swarm in her stomach and her heart jumps out of her chest, the Duke sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, saying that he was a little tired. She smiled and said that while they were on their way back, he could rest a little. Syria looked out the window with a smile as she assumed that the Archduke was also very tired. She was a little puzzled as she would have liked to be alone with her lover a little longer, but she knew that he was in order because they would see each other again soon. A moment later, the Archduke heard a voice that was familiar to Pain. The young man looked at the Duke intently, and with a grin said that it seemed to everyone that the Duke treated his sister with contempt, but in fact this was not so. He was astonished that the Duke had stopped the export of wheat to the Schumacher family, and in doing so, he sent a message to the nobles of the South that their ignorance would never be forgotten. He looked at the Archduke with a grin and said that this situation was very interesting because the lady's real personality was the complete opposite of the rumors about her. Marcus was amazed that even the Grand Duke had been drawn into a social fight, but at the same time, he was tormented by doubts that a man like the Grand Duke would try in such a way to leave a good impression on the nobility. He looked at the young man intently and asked if this was all because of the young lady. The Archduke in turn sighed heavily and called the Marquise, but at the same time he removed his hand from his shoulder. He looked at him sharply and said coldly that he should not mention the lady so carelessly while squeezing his shoulder. The Archduke looked menacingly at the young man and asked if he understood him. The Marquis stepped back and said with a smile that he understood. The Marquis looked intently at the radiologist and, gritting his teeth, said that his mother was born in a vassal state. He thought for a moment about the young lady, for it seemed to him that the Duke doted on him. It seemed to him that she even melted the Archduke's heart. He looked at the young man with a grin, because he knew that everything was very interesting. For this reason, he wanted to meet her in person. The Grand Duke was a little alarmed, as he had been walking around all day, and had not been himself, and he did not understand why there had been such a sudden change. He remembered the young man, as it was the first time he had behaved in such a way, and so he ended up accepting a lady's offer of tea, which was not at all his style. He knew perfectly well that he should have refused her, but he didn't have the courage to answer her in such a tone. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was sure he did not want to get back together. Syria refused him with a gentle smile and said that since she had already debuted, she thought it would be better to live in the capital for a while before the social season ended. He sighed heavily and said that he would like them to return together. The Duke looked closely at his sister, for he had agreed to leave her and asked her to write to him more often. She smiled and agreed with him, and also wished him a good journey and asked him to be careful. For a while she stared at her brother, but in her heart she was glad that he had finally left. After all, she knew perfectly well that she could now concentrate on developing her relationship with the great Duke. At that very moment, she looked at her maid with a joyful smile, since she had arrived just in time since she had some errand for the maid. Surya looked at her faithful servant with joy and showed her the invitation to tea, and at the same time, she asked that the invitation be sent to the great Archduke. The maid hesitated for a moment. She was worried if everything would really be all right. The young lady asked in confusion what she meant. Sophie apologized for her impudence, but she had heard that rumors had spread that the young lady had a romantic affair with the Grand Archduke. Syria looked at her maid and asked her not to worry, as she knew that everything was fine. She said with a smile that a lady's honor would not be offended by such rumors, but she knew that these rumors were only to her advantage. At that moment, the maid told her mistress with a smile that she was right, because her thoughts were too superficial. Syria smiled and told her maid that everything was fine, and she understood that she would be worried about her. The lady also asked her maid to be sure to wait for an answer. Some time later, the butler informed the Grand Archduke that he had received an invitation from the young lady. Cardi looked closely at the small letter as he noticed that it smelled delicious, but at that very moment he froze, looking at the invitation. After some time, the maid informed the young lady that she had received a reply from Cardi. The young lady looked at the reply with a joyful smile, as she was a little surprised, because only a day had passed, and he had already given his reply. She knew that a lot of time had passed, but she saw the very familiar handwriting of her lover. But a moment later, she froze in place in surprise. Syria was shocked because she was rejected by her lover. The Grand Archduke declined her invitation, but this did not come as a great surprise to her, for the reason for his refusal was anxiety. And even her maid had mentioned this earlier. The great Archduke was worried that people would start gossiping about her because of him. She sighed heavily and called her maid. Syria knew perfectly well that she would not leave it like that. Some time later, the Grand Archduke received a whole mountain of letters from the young lady. So after several days of struggling with the young man, she received a joyful answer because he thanked her for the invitation and also said that time does not matter, so she should write herself when it would be convenient for her to meet him. She was happy because she was able to achieve his consent. Cardi made his way to the meeting place with the young lady. He was a little nervous because he knew that today was a very important day, and yet he had not closed his eyes all night. Insomnia became chronic due to the heavy strain on the battlefield, but he was much more worried about today's meeting with the young lady. The butler looked intently at his master and called him. A moment later, he told the gentleman that he would choose a suitable gift for the meeting, but the young man firmly refused him. He said with a gentle smile that a bouquet of yellow daffodils would be ideal as a gift, but in turn, the young man was a little puzzled. He didn't understand why yellow daffodils popped into his mind. He didn't choose the gifts himself. His assistant always took care of everything. He knew that he had to put all his worries aside and close his eyes for a moment. After all, he didn't want to seem rude and sullen, offending the young lady because of his lack of sleep. But to his surprise, a young lady with a joyful smile was waiting for him. Cardi greeted the young lady with a smile and thanked her for the invitation. And just a moment later, he presented her with a beautiful yet modest gift. She froze for a moment as she was surprised by his gift. But at the same moment, she was touched by such a beautiful and wonderful gift. Cardi looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't like the gift. At that moment, filled with embarrassment, she shouted that it was simply impossible. Syria shouted with a joyful smile that daffodils were her favorite flowers in the world. He froze for a moment and looked at her with a gentle smile, but at the same time, he was confused by her radiant smile. He did not understand what was going on at all, since every emotion on her face made his heart flutter. A moment later, the young lady with a joyful smile asked her companion to go inside. Syria smiled and said that the weather had been pleasant lately, so she suggested that the best option would be to have tea on the terrace. Looking around, she smiled and happily said that this year she planned to grow tulips of different colors in the garden. He looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that it would be incredibly beautiful. She smiled and asked if he would like to visit her again when the tulips were in bloom. The Duke was taken aback for a moment as he was embarrassed by such words. But after a moment, he looked away from her in embarrassment and agreed. The lady immediately beamed with happiness and with a joyful smile said that she was looking forward to the day when they would meet again. Syria, looking at her lover, said that she wanted to be synonymous with honesty because this terrace was her favorite place in this house. And the bench is the best place to admire the beauty of the garden. She spoke tenderly of how when she sat and looked at the sunset or the night sky, she felt peaceful and at ease. In a past life, they often sat together on the terrace, admiring the flower field. She knew that these were simply unforgettable warm days that they spent together. But now they turned into memories that only she remembered. Looking at her lover, she understood that she was just a stranger to him. The great Archduke looked closely at the young lady and asked with concern if everything was all right with her, as he saw that she had become quiet. He took her hand gently and said tenderly that during the war, there were times when he could not overcome his fear of battle, and he knew very well that at times it was difficult to control his feelings and calm down. Cardi, looking at the young lady, she said that of course she understands everything, and she does not have such fears. But right now, he could clearly see that inside, she was also fighting a battle because she looked very confused. The young lady froze in place for a moment and looked at her lover in surprise because she realized that he had no memories of the days that they lived together. He looked at her with embarrassment and said that if something was bothering her, she could always tell him about it. She froze as she saw that beloved person whom she had always known. She saw that in front of her was her lover, who was very kind to her and sweet without looking at the young man. She asked him to hold her hand a little longer. The young lady was really fine now. She knew that they were now creating new and bright memories together. Syria looked into the distance with a smile because she noticed that there was no better place in the city to admire the garden and the sky. She smiled and asked her companion if he liked this place because a pleasant, fresh wind blew. Cardi sighed heavily and said that he liked everything because the garden was really beautiful. He understood that the garden was not important now since the young lady was important to him. Cardi looked closely at his companion as he knew that she looked like a real forest fairy. She smiled and apologized for not giving him a proper reception. Syria informed her companion that she would arrange a formal reception at the proper level the next time he came to visit her. He nodded thoughtlessly, agreeing with her. At that very moment, the young lady looked at him with a smile as she saw that he was immersed in his thoughts. The young man shuddered as he was a little carried away by her and his thoughts. Syria, looking at the Grand Duke, said that she still had to ask about something. She moved closer to him and asked if he had slept poorly last night. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected such a question. At that very moment, he smiled and said that he was fine. But she knew that this was not true, because she knew very well about his problems with sleep, so she suggested that he take a little nap. She was angry because she knew that he was trying to deceive the wrong person. Syria stared at her lover, as she clearly knew that he had chronic insomnia. He thought for a moment, as he could not allow himself to do such a thing. She smiled and said that being a knight was good, but everyone should know the limits of their abilities. She was very nervous, because she did not know what could happen if someone hurt him. Cardi looked at her in surprise, because he did not understand why she was so puzzled. At that very moment, the young lady asked her companion with a smile if he would like another cup of tea. He thanked her with a smile. Syria informed him that she had prepared chamomile tea, and she hoped that he would like it. A moment after drinking the tea, he involuntarily leaned against his companion. She smiled as she hoped that now he could sleep. Syria looked at us tenderly at her lover and said that she had specially prepared chamomile tea because it promotes relaxation. She looked at him intently, not knowing how many nights he had been awake this time. Syria gently laid him on her lap and said with a smile that in this life she wanted to be the one he could rely on. She asked him to be with her in this new life of hers, and she stroked his head with tenderness and care, and also kissed him. Syria, filled with embarrassment, pulled away from her lover. She was a little confused, as she knew that kissing was a common thing in the past. But now, for some reason, she felt awkward. Her heart was pounding like crazy, and to her regret, she could do nothing about it. The young man slowly opened his eyes, as he did not understand when he had managed to fall asleep at all. At that very moment, he saw small, pale palms in front of him. He was taken aback as he realized what had happened. She smiled and asked her companion if she had managed to wake him up. Cardi immediately pulled away from the young lady and apologized in a puzzled manner, as he hadn't meant to do anything like that. But by pure chance, he had fallen asleep on her lap. She smiled and said she knew it. He was embarrassed and taken aback, asked in surprise, "Really?" And all this time, we had been covering his face with our hands so that the sunlight would not be able to wake him up. She smiled and said it wasn't such a big deal. At that very moment, she asked him with a smile how he was feeling because she wanted to know if he had rested well. He sighed heavily and said that he was fine, so she didn't need to worry. She said with a beaming smile that she was now convinced that the chamomile tea she had prepared had been a good idea after all. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected to hear anything like that at all. She smiled and asked how much he knew about tea. Cardi looked at her with bewilderment and said that he was not particularly interested in the topic. She smiled and looked away from him, and also informed him that if it became known in social circles that she had made this tea for him, it might become a topic of conversation. Syria looked at the young man and said that chamomile tea, which was widely available, was used by people of all walks of life, and she heard that he had been on the battlefield for a long time. So now she thought he was just incredible, but also very tired and stressed. She looked closely at the young man and reported that the chamomile tea had a calming effect. In the past, it was this tea that the great Archduke loved most. After all, when he couldn't sleep, she would brew him tea from chamomile petals. She always enjoyed watching him slowly fall asleep after a cup of tea. Syria knew that this tea helped calm the nervous system and help a person fall asleep quickly and soundly. Even if it was just a moment, she was happy that she could enjoy this nostalgic moment that reminded her of the old days. Syria said, with a happy smile, that she was very glad that she could help him fall asleep. Cardi looked at his companion in surprise, and intently, as it seemed to her that she had been observing his condition for a long time. His value was determined only by his endless victories on the battlefield. Until now, there was not a single person who would think about his suffering. Even he never thought about it. He turned his embarrassed gaze away from his young companion and said that, in fact, he couldn't even remember how long it had been since he had slept so soundly and peacefully. But at that very moment, he looked at his companion with an embarrassed gaze and thanked her for her attention and care. She was glad because she saw his refreshing shining eyes, and at the same moment, she thanked him with a radiant smile for telling her about it. Cardi froze for a moment as a strange feeling came over him. It seemed to him that she was someone he had loved for a long time. Some time later, he thanked her with a gentle smile for inviting him to her residence. The young lady looked at him tenderly and said that she had nothing to thank her for, as it was a great honor for her to receive such a guest. Their meeting ended on a good note, and she was glad that she could see his face, which was smiling with a gentle and fresh smile. And in her joy, she told the maid that they could now go inside. A moment later, Sophie said of her mistress that a letter had recently arrived from the Baroness. The young lady was a little surprised to receive a letter from the barony of Chaser for her. She knew that he, the current baron, served as an official of the imperial family. She understood that this was very strange, because she had never been connected with this family before. Syria paused for a moment, remembering that before her return, the humble defense minister had suddenly risen to the position of deputy minister for administrative affairs and had rapidly begun to gain power, though everyone remained silent about it. But rumors continued to spread. After all, it was said that the barony of Chaser received support from the Marquess of Northumberland, since the Baroness was close to the Marquise's mother. Syria asked her maid to give her the letter. Syria was a little surprised, as the Baroness wanted to invite her, the lady, to a tea party to introduce small talk, and she was also thinking of inviting other noble ladies of high standing. She noticed that the letter was written very well and politely. The Baroness also wrote that she would do everything possible to create an environment in which all ladies could communicate well, regardless of status. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew that there was a completely different message behind these words. After all, usually such tea parties were organized by those who had a high status in society and invited noble ladies of low status to such events. She was puzzled and did not understand how some baroness could boldly invite a duchess. She realized that instead of treating her as a representative of the duchy, she was treating her as a newcomer who had just made her debut in high society. Syria said that the young lady had strong support since she was so brazenly disrespectful to the ducal family. She knew this wasn't something the Baroness could pull off alone, and she could only explain this by the fact that the barony operated under the patronage of the Marquis. The Marquis used the Baron to quietly expand his power in the imperial family. In the past, her lover had certainly not been on friendly terms with the Marquis. She could not predict his thoughts, but nevertheless she understood that since she remained in the estate, she would have to attend such an event at least once. She smiled, and looking at her maid, told her to convey that she accepted the young lady's invitation. She had no intention of avoiding her, and understood that she was doing everything for the sake of her lover. Syria accepted the invitation. The baronesses also began to drink, and the Baroness informed her of the time and place. Syria understood that at first glance, the guests might seem unremarkable to everyone, but as expected, the Marquis's mother will also be present at this celebration. In her past life, her relationship with the Marquis's family did not work out, all because Essen-Nortenberg, the emperor's nephew, was going to become the next emperor. But he is the one who provoked the emperor's hatred towards the Grand Duke and secured the emperor's support. People called him the imperial language, since he knew how to take advantage of the emperor's favor. Sometime later, the young lady threw all her thoughts away, as the maid informed her that the carriage had already been served. Syria, unfortunately, did not know the true intentions regarding this tea party, but she wanted to quickly return to her wonderful gift from her lover. And she also really wanted to meet her lover. When she arrived at the estate, she was met by a maid who asked for forgiveness, as the lady of the house wanted to apologize for not being able to meet her in person. Syria thought for a moment, as the Baroness had dared to invite her only lady of the empire from the ducal family, yet she sent a simple maid to meet her, instead of coming out and apologizing herself. She saw that the maid was a little scared. Syria sighed heavily and told the maid that her mistress should learn some etiquette. She looked at the girl intently and said that she shouldn't worry at all, because it wasn't her fault that her mistress had put her in a difficult situation. Syria looked closely at the maid and told her to go and tell her mistress that Lady Littenheim had arrived. At that moment, the maid bowed and said that she would do everything now. The young lady turned around in an instant as she heard a familiar voice. The Baroness greeted the young lady with a smile and asked for forgiveness, informing her guest that she had been talking with other ladies who had arrived earlier and were a little late. With a fierce grin, she asked him to understand her and forgive her. Syria, in turn, looked closely at the young lady as she saw that her gaze was not welcoming. The Baroness looked at the guest with a fierce grin as she saw that there was only a young child there. The only lady of the empire from the ducal family was right in front of her, but the Baroness understood that the young lady was just a maid's daughter who imagined herself to be a noble lady. Although she had previously heard rumors that the Duke adored his sister, but she assumed that these rumors were greatly exaggerated. She knew she had to give her guest a little solace before the Marquis's mother arrived. She said with a satisfied smile that the young lady had visited her humble home, and it was an honor for her. Syria looked at the Baroness with the same feigned smile and asked if she really thought it was an honor for her. The Baroness was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, as she did not understand what the young lady was talking about. Syria sighed heavily and said that just a few moments ago, she was extremely surprised to see the maid also politely waiting for her. She smiled and said that it was only her thoughts, but she thought that the Baroness should think about training her maids, as she felt that she had neglected the education of the servants. The Baroness was surprised she did not expect such a thing from the young lady. Syria looked at the young lady closely and asked if that wasn't the case. Then was it true that she ignored her to pay her respects to the other ladies? The young lady was taken aback and told her guest with a smile that she would never have ignored her, because as she had already said earlier, she was talking with the other ladies who had arrived. First, Syria asked if she really meant to say that the other ladies were preventing her from greeting the other guests. The Baroness was taken aback and said that this was not so. She was angry with her guest, because even though her mother was a lowly maid, the genes of the ducal family made themselves known. The Marquise looked at everyone present with a smile and asked for forgiveness for being late. Syria looked at the madam with a smile and said that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry. She knew that usually the person with the highest status is the last to arrive at the meeting place. The situation was similar with the imperial family, who came out late into the banquet hall. She understood that the Marquise intended to arrive later than her, in order to declare that she was in a higher position than her. The Marquise smiled and thanked the young lady for this. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that she was seeing her for the first time. Syria smiled and said that it was true, because it was her first time in the capital. The Marquise said with a smile that she was pleased to meet her young lady like this face to face. Syria sighed heavily and looked closely at the stamps, because she knew it was true that the Marquise's social status was very complicated. She also said with a smile that she was glad to meet them, but she knew that her status as the Duke's daughter was generally considered higher. The Marquise smiled and said that they could continue their conversation inside Syria. Knew that the Marquise was also an imperial princess, being the emperor's younger sister. She looked closely at the young ladies and said that the other ladies were already waiting for them. Syria looked closely at the Marquise as she acted very self-confidently, as if she was the mistress of the barony. Syria turned around and, looking at the Baroness, said that the Marquise's joyful greeting was still different from the rudeness that the Baroness had shown her. The Marchioness began to speak, but the young lady immediately interrupted her and said that being part of the ducal family, accepting the Baroness's invitation, was a gesture of the greatest mercy. She looked closely at the young lady and said that in return, she had sent a maid to accompany her. Syria glared at everyone present and said that she didn't think it was a bad idea to apologize after being greeted like that. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she was absolutely correct in her intentions. At that very moment, she looked at the Baroness and asked her to apologize for what she did to the young lady. The Baroness was shocked. She didn't want to do anything like that and insisted on it. At that very moment, the Marquise looked intently at the young lady and sternly told her to quickly apologize. She saw that the Baroness was simply an insignificant person. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she did not expect such humiliation. But gritting her teeth, she bowed and asked the young lady's forgiveness for having been rude to her. Syria looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that she accepted her apology. The Baroness was burning with rage and malice, as she did not understand why she had to ask the bastard for forgiveness. At the same time, the Marquise was looking intently at the young Syria. The Marquise noticed that the young lady was surprisingly not so simple. At the same time, the Archduke suddenly arrived at the Duke's mansion without any warning. Sophie was agitated and did not know what to do as her mistress was absent, as she was at the Baroness's tea party. The great Archduke thought for a moment after hearing these words. Some time later, 7 lovely ladies, including Syria, attended the tea party, and surprisingly, the atmosphere was very friendly. The lovely ladies had a good time and discussed who was getting married this season. Syria saw that most of the unmarried ladies talked a lot about marriage. At that moment, the young lady looked at Syria, as everyone knew that the young lady's partner at the debut ball was the Duke. The young ladies were surprised, as they knew that the young man was accompanying someone for the first time. She smiled and said that this was true because he was a very busy man. Syria said with a smile that she was also surprised when he decided to become her partner. At that very moment, the lovely ladies pounced on the lady because they wanted to know whether he had found a partner for his future life or whether he was single. She smiled and said that she definitely did not know this information. Syria looked closely at the young ladies, as she knew that her brother had been popular in her past life as well. She knew that her brother was an incredibly good candidate for the role of groom. The young lady looked at Syria intently and said with a smile that she probably didn't remember, but she was also present at the ball. She smiled and said that the video card Duke was treating her tenderly. She was a little envious, Syria thought for a moment. I don't know what to answer. Compared to her past life, she realized that her brother treated her much more gently. However, she didn't really know what he was thinking about right now. She didn't understand why he treated her like a dear little sister. The Marquise looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile, "And their relationship seems very good, like brother and sister." She looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and asked why she did not call the Duke affectionately by his name. She wanted to know if the young lady was being too rude to him and calling him by his title, since they were close as rumors said. And the young ladies looked at Syria intently, so they wanted to hear the answer to the question posed. After all, her every action was being watched, and she understood this perfectly well. Syria looked at everyone present with a gentle smile and said that she called him that, first of all, because he was a duke, and secondly, because he was her brother. She also said that she could not boast of her special relationship with someone like a duke. She looked intently at the Marquise and said that, since this could give free rein to the thoughts of those people who love to gossip and invent all sorts of misunderstandings and excuses, the Marquise looked at the young lady with a grin, as this was a very interesting answer to the question posed. She saw that the girl was surprisingly very smart. She wanted to test how much the young lady was worth to the Duke, and she thought that it would be easy to ridicule her in front of others. But to her surprise, she turned out to be no pushover. At that very moment, the young lady remembered something. She sighed heavily, and looking at everyone present in the press, was the great Archduke not also present at the debutante ball? Syria was a little confused and didn't understand why her lover's name suddenly came up in the conversation. The young lady looked away from everyone in embarrassment and said that she thought she had some prejudices about the Archduke. The other lady supported her, as he frightened everyone because of his great power, and no one knew how much power he had, and this frightened everyone. Syria looked at the young lady with a smile and would have started to speak, but she interrupted her, and looking at her, asked if the Archduke had helped her then. Then she said shyly that he returned to the ballroom with Syria, and she thought that he looked very nice. At the same moment, her friend supported her and said that she also thought about it. She said with admiration that he was as beautiful as a statue. Syria was a little puzzled and knew that this conversation was very strange, but she knew that it was good that the young ladies had such an opinion about her lover. But still, she was jealous because the other ladies showed interest in him. At that moment, the young lady looking at Syria said with a smile that the Archduke was certainly handsome, but she thought that the most impressive person at the debutante ball was Syria. Syria looked at her new acquaintance in surprise and asked for forgiveness, asking why she thought so. The lady smiled and said that she was not the only one who had this opinion. Other ladies also agreed with her. After all, the way the young lady was the first to invite the great and terrible Archduke to dance was truly impressive. The young ladies supported their friend because they personally were trying to get used to people and could only wait for men to ask them to dance, and they could not even talk to the person with whom they wanted to spend time. Looking at the young Syria, they saw a truly brave person, and so they all wanted to be at least a little like her. Syria was surprised because she understood that this all happened because she did not want to stand and watch as her beloved left the ball without dancing to at least one song. On top of that, she had an ulterior motive of wanting to dance with him. She was surprised because in her past life, staying and being ignored was the norm for her. But when she decided to respect herself, she felt a completely different attitude towards her person. Syria looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked if this was true. The Marquise smiled and said that the very fact that Togo was with them at the tea party pleased her child even more than she did. She smiled and said that her son even asked her to tell the young lady that he would like to treat her. She looked at the girl with joy and asked what she thought about it. Syria looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that she was truly grateful that he saw her in a good light. She was well aware that they had their own hidden intentions towards her. Syria looked closely at the Marquise and said that she thought she still needed time to adjust to high society. She knew that they were counting on being able to easily take advantage of her and her position. The Baroness was furious. She could not understand how the young lady dared to refuse this offer, despite the fact that the Marquise herself made her an excellent offer. At the same moment, the Marquise said that the first person the young lady invited to her mansion was the great Archduke. She said with a smile that having a man as the first guest in her home could be misunderstood in society as something vulgar. She also told the girl with a fake smile that she was very worried that our lady might have difficulty adjusting to high society. Syria knew very well that the Marquise would be very angry, but she said with a smile that she simply could not express her gratitude to someone who wanted to help, even in such insignificant matters. She said with a smile that she thought it would look pathetic and shameful. Syria looked intently at the Marquise as she understood that she had to stop everything that concerned her lover on the spot without retreating. A moment later, a maid approached them and asked for forgiveness. She informed her mistress that tea and cold drinks were ready. The Baroness asked the maid to serve them, but at the same time, she jumped up from her seat. The young ladies happily said that the Baroness was very knowledgeable about drinks. She surprised them every time and served new drinks every time. The Baroness looked at her guests with a smile as they embarrassed her very much. At the same time, the Marquise looked predatorily at the girl and gave her a signal. The young lady in turn accepted this signal and nodded in agreement. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a grin as she understood that now she would stop being arrogant. At that very moment, the young lady called the Baroness in surprise. Syria froze in place for a moment. She saw a tea set from the east, which was known for its difficulty in using. The Baroness in turn looked at the young lady with a fierce grin as she saw that she hesitated. She understood that the girl knew nothing about the customs of the east since she herself was from the south. The Marquise looked at the girl closely and said that she was still curious about what a lady from the ducal family was capable of. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. At that very moment, the Marquise asked the Baroness if she would help her. She asked the girl if she understood what she meant. She looked at the Marquise with a grin, knowing that her guest would soon pay for her arrogance. Syria froze for a moment, knowing that she had lost her composure just a few moments ago. The Baroness looked at the girl intently, as this time she wanted to make her feel all the humiliation. She looked at her guests with a smile and said that in front of them was an imported tea set from the east. The girls were surprised because they had heard that this item was very difficult to obtain. The young lady said with a smile that there were very few merchants who imported Eastern cheese tea, so she prepared a special tea for all of them today. She said with a smile that this tea was called Lucane, and in the East it was famous for its wonderful aroma. The Marquise looked at the girl with a smile, because she was very surprised when she learned that she had such a luxurious hobby. The young lady accepted the compliment with a smile and thanked the Marquise. The lovely ladies looked at the tea in surprise, as it was quite tasty. Syria saw that she had even prepared an expensive tea set, despite the fact that tea leaves from the East were difficult to brew. Syria sighed heavily as she realized that today's tea party must have seriously broken her spirit. She was puzzled, wondering if high society was really any different from the past. In her past life, she was humiliated at tea parties of this kind because they did not understand how she could show her inexperience during tea drinking. They mockingly said that she caused the Duke a lot of headaches. They didn't understand how she wasn't ashamed of her behavior. Syria looked timidly at everyone present and said that she was very glad that she would be able to try such good tea. Syria said with a smile that she believed that Eastern culture was little known to the empire, and the young lady supported her. Syria looked at everyone present with a smile and asked if she could first demonstrate how to drink tea properly. The Baroness and the Marquise were taken aback for a moment. The young ladies whispered awkwardly to each other because they knew that she had saved them, because they did not know how to drink this tea properly, so they assumed that this was her way of taking care of them. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a smile and said that if she was so confident, she could start first. Syria looked at the Marquise with a smile and asked her to wait a little. Syria slowly walked over to the tea set and began brewing some wonderful tea. The lovely ladies watched the whole process in surprise, as this spectacle was new to them. The Marchioness and the Baroness looked closely at the young lady, expecting her to make a mistake somewhere. After some time, Syria gave the young ladies some wonderful tea and said with a smile that they could all try it. She looked at everyone present with a smile and said that her skills, of course, could not compare with the Baroness, but she still hoped that they would like this tea. The lovely ladies looked at her in surprise and also praised her since the tea was wonderful. They wanted to know where she learned something like this. She smiled and said that she was fascinated by this issue and therefore studied everything thoroughly. Syria knew full well that this was not the case, and in the past, she had had quite a bitter experience, and she had had to learn everything. At that very moment, she looked intently at the Baroness and asked what she thought about it. The young lady was a little surprised, and at the same time puzzled. She did not understand how her guest could do something like that, because she knew that the Eastern culture was not yet widespread in the South. She sighed heavily and said that the part was really delicious. The Marquise, in turn, looked at the girl with a grin, since she understood that she was a complete non-entity. She smiled and said that the tea was of course excellent, but she also really liked this cup. She looked at the Baroness and asked if the cup was worth the price. The Baroness smiled and said that the service was worth the price, because she paid the equivalent of 5 carts for the service. Syria looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had really paid that much for this service. The Baroness looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked if something was wrong. Syria asked the Baroness, before buying the tea set, whether she had checked the artisan's stamp on the bottom of the cup. The Baroness looked at the girl with fury and said that, of course, she checked everything, because she was not ignorant in such matters. She showed the cup and said that this cup depicted plum petals made by the chief master of Chire. Syria sighed heavily and told the Baroness that she really didn't know something. Syria reported that there are 3 types of plum blossoms, those with 5, 4, and 3 petals, and only the cup made by a true master has 5 petals embossed on it. The Baroness angrily attacked the young lady and asked if she really meant to tell her to be careful what she bought. At that very moment, the Marquise sighed heavily and said with a smile that she had plans for the day, so she would leave them early. She looked closely at the girl and said that she did not need to see her off. It would be better for her to start looking for a merchant. Syria also stood up at that moment and said that she also needed to go. She smiled and said that she had already drunk enough tea. She looked at the Baroness closely and said that it was only her opinion, but she thought it would be good to make tea a place where everyone could enjoy it. After all, serving tea from an unfamiliar culture, without giving guests the opportunity to learn how to brew, it can seem quite rude. And at that very moment, the young lady sighed heavily and said that Syria was saying everything was correct because she personally was embarrassed by this act. They looked closely at the lady of the house and said that since she herself had been deceived by the merchant, she was also not very knowledgeable in this matter. A moment later, all the ladies stood up and said goodbye to the Baroness. The Baroness was furious. She did not understand what had happened and why everything was exactly like this. At that very moment, she furiously shouted for the servants to immediately bring the merchant to her Syria. At the same time, she left with a satisfied smile of a winner. A moment later, the Marquise called out to the lady standing on the street with a smile and said that today was a lot of fun. She looked closely at the girl and said that, although she was still very young, she had cleverly united all the ladies. And this was very wonderful, because anyone who was present there would have thought that it was she who had organized the tea party. Syria glared at the Marquise, as she assumed she had gone too far beyond being a simple guest. She said that her family rarely visited the empire, but there was one thing no one knew. Syria glared at the Marquise and said that any member of her family would never tolerate actions that would undermine the reputation of the great house. Syria said with a grin that they would remove any opponent from their path, and at the same moment, she noticed that the Marquise was an old friend of the Baroness. The Marquise froze for a moment and looked at the girl in surprise, as she noticed that she was using the Baroness to test her. The Marquise understood that if this was the case, then this was a warning not to challenge Littenheim. The Marquise was surprised as she saw before her an incredibly experienced young girl who had recently debuted in the new social world. She understood that if the young lady gained the experience of a lady from a large aristocratic family, she would be a priceless treasure. At that very moment, a young man approached them and said with a smile that he had come to the estate to see his mother, but he could not have imagined that on his way he would meet a beautiful young lady. The Marquise looked at her son with a smile, since he had come after all. He looked at the girl with a smile and said that he simply assumed that they were destined to meet. She looked intently at the young man, for she saw before her none other than Essen Northernbert. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he was very sorry that he could not greet her separately at the debutante ball. Syria looked at the young man with a joyful smile, for she knew that she should avoid him in Meru. At the same moment, she said that it was very nice to see him come to visit his beloved mother. She wanted to say that she should leave since they had met in a way that she did not want to disturb them. At that very moment, the young man said with a smile that he was very glad that the young lady had formed a positive opinion of him, so he invited her to dinner at that very moment. He smiled and asked when it would be convenient for her to have lunch with him. Syria looked closely at the young man, as she saw that he didn't even bother to ask what she thought about it. She thanked him with a smile for the invitation, and at the same moment said that she was not yet grown up enough to meet someone one-on-one. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a smile and asked her to think and give her son some of her attention. She was furious and did not understand how bold her married child was. An ordinary servant does not know her place. She did not understand how the girl dared to reject her son. The Marquise said with a smile that it would not be difficult to share the mealtime, since her son might be embarrassed if she continued to refuse. She smiled and said that he was not so green and young to fall in love with her at first sight, and for the young lady, it would not be a big problem. Syria looked at the young man with bewilderment, because she did not understand why he just stood there and calmly watched and listened to such conversations, because it irritated her. She noticed that not only the Marquise, but also her son were very strange. At the same moment, she asked for forgiveness and said that she had no intention of changing her mind. A moment later, the Grand Duke approached them and asked what such nonsense was needed for her. He looked at them intently and asked if the young ladies had not made it clear to them that this was inconvenient for her. Syria froze for a moment and stared at her lover, as she had not expected to see him at all. At that very moment, the Marquis looked at the young man with a fierce grin, and a moment later, he asked what he was doing in the Baroness's residence. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man in surprise, as she also wanted to know how he ended up in the residence. The Grand Duke looked away from them awkwardly, not knowing how to explain his arrival. She looked at him in surprise, as she wanted to hear an answer. A moment later, the young man said that it was just a small coincidence. Everyone looked at him in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. Syria looked at the young man with bewilderment. She didn't know what the chances were that the great Archduke could accidentally be strolling near the Baroness's estate. He really came to the estate on purpose. He didn't know if it was okay for him to show his affection for her in front of everyone. He was very afraid that he could cause problems for the young lady. But he had no intention of retreating, so looking at the Marquise's cheetah, he wanted to fight them back. At that very moment, he looked intently at the young lady and called her. Cardi sheepishly said he would like to accompany her to the mansion. She froze for a moment, as she did not expect this. She assumed that he knew that she was with the Marquise and Marchioness, so she wondered if it could be that he was worried, and that was why he came to take her away. She saw that despite his feigning calm, his ears were very red. With the speed of lightning, she suddenly grabbed the young man by the hand and told the Marquise that she was very sorry, but they would not be able to dine together since she intended to return with the Archduke. As she left, she smiled and said that they would see each other later. The Marquise was furious. She did not understand how to raise such a thing. The Marquise was burning with anger and fury. She did not understand who the young lady thought she was to treat them like that. The young man hastened to calm his enraged mother. The Marquis looked after them with a fierce grin as he realized that she had refused him and accepted the Archduke's offer. He watched the young people closely as he was now even more interested in her. The young lady looked at her companion intently and asked him how he knew that she had been at this tea party. She smiled and asked him to tell her the truth, as she knew that he had lied, that they had met by chance. Cardi thought for a moment and looked away with embarrassment, not knowing how to explain it all. He sighed heavily and said that he was on his way to her mansion because he was very sorry that he had fallen asleep during their tea party that day. The young lady smiled and said that he didn't need to worry about that at all. Cardi sheepishly said that he wanted to make up for that incident in a proper way. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, he said embarrassed that he had prepared something for her, albeit a small but still a small gift. She looked at the small box in surprise, as she was surprised by the similar. Syria looked at her companion and asked if she could open the box. Without looking at the young lady, he sheepishly said that she could do it. When she opened the box, she froze as she saw the lovely perfume. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know much about gifts for girls, but he had received some recommendations, so he gave her this gift. He was advised that he should definitely choose perfume since the young lady would be left with a mark from his gift. He smiled and said that he had chosen the scent himself, which would suit the young lady. She was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. Cardi told his companion that if she didn't like it, he didn't finish and froze in place, because he didn't know what to do if she refused to accept his gift. At that very moment, the young lady thanked him with embarrassment because she was very happy. She smiled and said that the fact that he came to the mansion to personally give her the gift was already admirable, and the fact that he personally chose the perfume for her struck her to the depths of her soul. So she thanked him with a smile for coming for her, and she also said that, in reality, she and the Marquise did not get along as well as it might seem from the outside. He looked at her with a tender smile, because seeing the young lady happy was enough for him. Syria looked at her lover with tenderness, as she was filled with energy from within. She did not know how to describe these feelings. As for the merchant who deceived the Baroness a few days later, news appeared that he had been arrested. It was said that not only the Baroness, but also other people had fallen victim to him. The perfume that the Grand Archduke had given her matched perfectly with her makeup and hairstyle. And at the same time, she was getting ready to meet her lover, since he had invited her first. Some time later, the maid informed the young lady that the Archduke had arrived. At that very moment, she joyfully said that she was already on her way to him. As they were returning to the residence, the young man sheepishly asked his companion if she had any free time. She was a little surprised, but he said that last time he fell asleep at tea and kept thinking about it. He understood perfectly well that he had ruined that day and wanted to somehow make up for lost time. Cardi, looking at the young lady, the lady said that, no, a new park had opened a long time ago, and it was one of the most popular attractions in the empire, and so he wanted to take her there. At that very moment, the young lady blossomed as she realized that this was an invitation to a date. She happily shouted that she really wanted to go there with him. The Archduke looked at his companion with a tender smile, as he was glad that everything was working out well. Syria was very happy that her lover invited her to visit the park together. She knew that this was a new place, which was a landmark of the empire, and this place would appeal to any lady. The young lady became deeply immersed in her thoughts, and at that moment stopped and wondered how her lover knew about such places. She was a little puzzled, because she did not know the answer to the question posed. But at that very moment she came because she heard a familiar voice. For a moment she saw her lover in all his glory, and with a radiant smile. Without hesitation, she quickly rushed to meet him. The young man froze for a moment as he saw that she was the most fragile girl in the world. Syria looked at him with a happy smile and asked if he liked the smell of the perfume that he had given her earlier. She smiled and asked if this smell suited her. He froze for a moment and then coldly said that they suited her, but he was very embarrassed at the same time, and he was even more embarrassed when she thanked him with a joyful smile. Cardi looked away as he realized his words had come out harshly. He didn't understand how he could have said something like that in front of her. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her companion because she knew what he really was like. She saw that he was modest and sweet. Syria V was very happy that she had not made a mistake and had taken advantage of his gift. Sometime later, they were driving to the park, and the great Archduke told his companion about everything on the way. He also said that, after a walk in the park, he was going to go to a coffee shop by the lake. She was surprised that he had organized everything in advance, but he only said that if she walked for a long time, she might get very tired. Cardi said with a smile that he thought it would be nice to have a planned route in advance. The young lady looked closely at her companion as she saw that he had planned everything. It seemed to her that this place was familiar to him. Also, on the way to the park, he told her about the coffee shop and ice cream. She was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing. They also talked about music. Syria stood there for a moment, with a smile on her face, as she knew that this was all very strange, since the Archduke she knew was completely indifferent to others, and lacked any sense of delicacy, because he served as a soldier. Syria wondered if he had taken a course on how to organize and date beforehand, so he knew how to spend time with his girlfriend. Syria wondered if he had started dating someone other than her. She knew that if she ignored the rumors that he was a monster, then looking at him now, she could tell that he was a wonderful match. Syria knew very well that he was very handsome, and was also one of the 3 great lords of the empire, and his wealth was impressive. Besides the fact that the emperor hated the Archduke, he was interested in finding a partner and potentially prolonging the young man's life. She knew there was a good chance the Grand Archduke had already met someone before her. Cardi looked at his companion in surprise, as he did not understand what had suddenly happened. He did not understand why the young lady had suddenly lost her mood. In a hurry, with concern in his voice, he asked if she was unhappy with today's plan of action. He said that he had made a lot of efforts to make her happy. At that moment, the young lady looked at him timidly and said she wanted to know something from him. She wanted to confide her heart to him. The young man froze for a moment. He didn't know what question she would ask him. She understood that even if he went on a date with another lady, it could not be considered a crime. But if before her, he was married to another girl, then this was a completely different matter. After all, in her past life, there were no rumors about his aroma with someone. But now she understood that this life could be different. She did not understand what kind of incomprehensible feelings she now felt in her chest. Cardi looked at her companion, sighed heavily, and asked if something had really happened. She looked at him intently, as she knew that he had previously said that he loved only her. At that very moment, filled with confusion and anger, she asked him if he had ever fallen in love with another woman. Cardi froze for a moment, not expecting to hear anything like that. Cardi was a little confused and embarrassed by the question, as he didn't understand why she was asking that. At that moment, everyone was thinking about their own things. The young man was puzzled and did not know what to answer. He understood that he should not imagine unnecessary things for himself. And his companion noticed that he did not answer for a long time, which meant that he had had a relationship before her. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and apologized for asking such a question, since it was his personal life, and she had no right to interfere in other people's business. Syria sighed heavily as she wanted to stop there. She understood that she had to close this issue because she had not met her lover for a long time, but at that moment, the young man said that he had never had personal meetings with other ladies. He looked at her intently and asked her to take his word for it. Syria, in turn, breathed a sigh of relief, but still asked how he knew about all the places that girls liked. At that moment, he abruptly turned his embarrassed gaze away from her and said that in fact, he did not know what kind of food or what places the ladies preferred. Without looking at his companion, he said that he had simply carefully studied the book. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had read the book and understood everything at once. He smiled and said that the time spent with her was precious to him, so he wanted to think of the perfect plan. When she opened the book, she froze in place because she saw that it was full of underlining and notes, and at the same moment she was distracted from the book because the young man said that earlier she mentioned his personal life. Cardi looked at her intently and said that she was the kind of person who could ask him anything without thinking. Syria looked away from him sheepishly and said that somehow, when she was with him, it seemed to her that only happy and pleasant moments were happening. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had the same impression. Sometime later, they were strolling merrily through the park, and the young lady asked her companion if it was normal that she wasn't making any effort, but was simply being with him. She smiled and said she was already feeling better. They walked around the park for a while, and the Grand Duke told her the whole history of the park. The young lady also supported him and added her own words. She looked around with joy as she noticed that the park was truly beautiful, and thanks to her companion, she was still able to visit this place. At that very moment, he burst into embarrassment and, looking away, said that he was very glad that they had gone out for a walk after all. Surya looked at her lover with a gentle smile, as she understood that if her past life had been her last, she would not have been able to see her lover in such a light. Surya was very glad that she was finally able to return to the past. While walking in the park, she smiled and said that she had a question for him. A moment later, she asked why he hadn't found a partner for the recent debutante ball. He sighed heavily and said that he simply thought it was unnecessary, since after all the debutante ball was just a formality. He said that he was present there only as a person with the status of Archduke, and besides, he didn't think that there would ever be a lady who would want to be his partner. At that very moment, she looked at him intently and asked if she could continue to be his partner in the future, if he felt that way. Cardi was taken aback for a moment and froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a question. At that very moment, he clenched his fist in rage and said that if he agreed, gossip would begin to spread about the young lady, and because of him, her honor could suffer. She smiled and said that she didn't see a problem with it because she didn't care about such gossip, and she decided to do as Togo herself wanted. Looking at her lover, she firmly said that, as his partner, she wants to build a good relationship with him in the future. But he couldn't just let her go, and so he himself said that he agreed with her. He didn't want to hide his heart and table or hide it from hers. He really wanted to tell her only the truth. She looked at him with a smile and extended her hand to secure their union. He thought that such luck had always passed him by, but now he realized that this was not so. She looked at him with a smile and wished him luck. A moment later, they were walking along a small path, and the young lady noticed that someone had made a heart shape out of fallen flowers. She came closer because she thought it was very cute. The young man agreed with her, and getting up, she accidentally stumbled and began to fall, but her companion managed to deftly catch her. She was a little confused and embarrassed as she found herself caught in his clinging embrace. Without looking at her companion, she thanked him shyly. Cardi, excited but also embarrassed, asked the young woman if she was okay. She sighed heavily and said she was fine. She had tripped because she had been in a hurry, but she was fine now. He said I was glad she was okay, but also noted that the park had just opened, so there weren't many walking paths yet. The young lady thought for a moment, as she now understood why the path sparkled so. Cardi looked closely at his companion and said that from now on, he wanted to accompany her. If she didn't mind, Syria was embarrassed by this and couldn't utter a word. But after a few moments, she agreed, and they slowly walked further into the park. She was glad that she had stumbled, because now she could feel the warmth of her lover. A moment later, they were taken aback as they heard a man's voice calling them. He said that if they came to spend time together, then they simply needed to make a portrait on canvas as a keepsake. He smiled and said that he would draw it and give them a discount. Syria looked at the man with embarrassment as she realized that, from the outside, they looked like a couple in love. She wanted to refuse, but at that moment, the great Archduke asked his companion if she would like to capture this day as a memory. Cardi looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't want to do it. She wanted something like this, but she was very afraid that she could embarrass her companion with something like this. But surprisingly, he wanted to do it. Looking at her companion, she wondered if it didn't bother him that they were mistaken for lovers. Cardi sighed heavily and apologized to his companion for such a misunderstanding. At that very moment, she pouted her beautiful lips and asked if he was really indignant because they had been mistaken for lovers. Cardi screamed that this was not true at all, and at that very moment, the man asked the lovers not to quarrel, and he also asked them to stay closer to each other. Syria sat closer to her lover and asked the artist if she was sitting normally, but at that very moment, the man shouted for them to sit closer to each other. She moved a little closer, but unfortunately, this was not enough for the artist. He immediately stood up and sat the young people down as he needed to. The young people in turn froze in place and were filled with embarrassment, since they did not know where closer they could sit, because they were very close to each other. The great Archduke, despite everything, fulfilled the artist's request, trying with all his might, while the young lady watched everything that was happening from the side. She restrained herself from laughing, since the spectacle was truly mesmerizing. A moment later, she couldn't help but burst into wild laughter, but at the same time asked her partner for forgiveness. The young man smiled and said that everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry. She burst into tears of laughter and said that his face was too mixed up, so she couldn't hold back. At the same time, Cardi looked at his companion with a tender smile. The artist shouted that the young people were behaving well and should remain in that pose. A few minutes later, the artist informed the young people that their portrait was ready. The young lady looked intently at the beautiful portrait as she realized that all the efforts and suffering were worth the beautiful result. Syria looked at the young man with a smile and asked if he thought the same as she did. For a moment, he took the painting from her and began to study it intently with his keen eye. She was a little surprised and puzzled as he stared intently at the painting. Cardi froze for a moment, a little surprised and confused, as it was the first time he had seen such an expression on his face. He noticed the tender look with which he looked at his companion. At that very moment, the Grand Duke looked intently at his companion and asked, embarrassed, if he could keep the painting for himself. But after a few seconds, he was taken aback and embarrassedly asked her to pretend that she had not heard this. Syria looked at him with a smile and said that he could take the portrait if he liked it so much. She said that she was worried because she didn't know how to repay him, but it all came out just in time since she had received perfume from him as a gift, so she wanted to give him a painting in return. At the same moment, she asked with a smile if he didn't mind. The young man looked closely at his companion as he realized that she had said such words so that he would not feel burdened. He had never gone for walks with anyone before. There was no one who did not fear him and treated him with such warmth. He had no idea how he could be with someone so sincere, but now he understood it because he wanted to express his gratitude to her. At that very moment, he looked tenderly at his companion and said that he would keep this painting like the apple of his eye. He understood perfectly well that she had taught him a lot. Something in him changed when she was next to him, and then he became a little happier. Some time later, the young people visited a coffee shop, and then her Naledi, with delight, examined every corner of the coffee shop since she was pleased to sit next to him in such an environment. Syria looked at her companion with a smile and said that she was very interested in what special dish was in the coffee shop. After this question, her companion took the answer seriously and began to carefully study the menu and tell her about everything. But he made a small mistake, and her ice cream laughed. She looked at him closely and said with a satisfied smile that it seemed like he had remembered everything from the book. Cardi smiled casually and said that, of course, it was because he wanted their walk to be perfect. She looked at him with a smile and said that he could order something at his discretion. He was surprised as she didn't even look at the menu. She smiled and said that it was okay because she wanted to try what he had to offer her. As he left, he smiled and said that he would quickly place an order and return to her. She said with a smile that she would look forward to seeing him. She stared at him for a moment longer as he slowly walked away from her. She knew they hadn't gone on dates like this in her past life because her husband could be called to more battles at any moment. The emperor often used the young lady as a tool to control the Grand Archduke, threatening to separate them. And all this was because of her status in the family, because no one from the family would be furious or protest because of the divorce. Syria knew perfectly well that she would not allow such a thing to happen in this life. She did not want her lover to become the emperor's puppet again because of her. She understood that she had to change her relationship with her older brother. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she was focused on her lover and completely forgot about her brother. She understood that she had to write a letter as soon as she returned to the estate. At the same time, the young man anxiously asked his subordinate if there was still no news from his sister. The young man looked intently at his master and said that he had not received any letters yet. The Duke in turn thought for a moment. He was puzzled because he did not understand what she had been doing, that she had not sent him a single letter yet. At the same time, the young lady enjoyed a pleasant time with her boyfriend, and she also enjoyed a wonderful dessert. Cardi looked at her with an embarrassed smile and asked if she really enjoyed the treat. She said with a smile that she liked everything and also asked if he had ordered chamomile tea for himself. He smiled and said that he now drinks it from time to time after their last meeting. Syria asked her companion if he had been suffering from insomnia lately. He smiled and said that he was already feeling much better. Syria looked at the young man with a joyful smile and said that she was glad to hear it. In turn, the great Archduke looked intently at his companion, as he knew that she was simply a work of art. At that very moment, she asked with a smile why he hadn't tried dessert yet. He looked away from her with embarrassment as he felt awkward answering this question. She noticed that he was very embarrassed. She knew that in reality, he just hated sweets in her mind. She asked him for forgiveness, as she just wanted to tease him a little. Syria, with a joyful smile, handed him a small piece of dessert and asked him to try it. The young man stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do. She saw how he tried to control himself. Syria immediately said with a smile that it was just a joke and he shouldn't try the dessert. But the young man, he will eat it, and at the same time, he reached for the dessert. The young lady froze in place for a moment in shock, as she did not expect this. She froze and stared at him. Taken aback, the young lady immediately asked why he had eaten dessert since she knew he hated sweets. He smiled and said that it was simple, since it was she who suggested it. Syria froze and looked at the young man in surprise, as she realized that he was the same as before. In her past life, he often traveled to the empire on business. Then, he would buy her cookies every time from a famous bakery, because she loved sweets very much. And then she would also try to play a joke on him. Cardi told her every time that he could only eat sweets if they came from his wife. At that very moment, the great Archduke looked at his companion and asked in surprise how she knew that he hated sweets. Syria in turn was taken aback, as she did not know how to answer this question. Syria smiled and timidly said that most men she knew hated sweets. Cardi looked closely at her companion and hesitated, asking with her eyes what was going on. She looked at him in surprise, but he immediately looked away from her and said that he just had too many thoughts in his head and she didn't need to worry about anything. She smiled and said that seeing him in such a state was a little disturbing. Cardi looked closely at the young lady and said that he was very curious to know what men were being talked about. Syria was taken aback for a moment, not knowing how to answer his question. At that very moment, she asked him if he didn't like that she communicated with other men. He froze as he had not expected such a question. He did not want to hide his feelings from his companion, so he wondered how honest he could be. Taking his embarrassed gaze away from her, he said that he thought she was right. But he understood that he had no right to interfere in the personal relationships of a young lady. At that very moment, she stood up and shouted that this was not so, and he was always allowed. She looked at him intently as she began talking about the men she had mentioned earlier. She smiled and said she meant her brother, as she didn't communicate with anyone else. The young man beamed with happiness when he heard this answer to the question. She looked at him tenderly as she felt relieved. She didn't know what to do, because even in this life, she didn't love him one bit less. A moment later, they turned around because they heard the Marquise's voice. He looked at the young people with a predatory grin and said that he could not even imagine that he would meet Lady Littenheim herself in this establishment. Syria looked menacingly at the young man and said that he had just seen the Archduke and Littenheim. Essen looked at the great Archduke in surprise and said with a smile that he had not noticed him. Cardi looked menacingly at the Marquis and asked if he would rather spend time with the lady who was next to him. The Marquis smiled and thanked the Archduke for his concern, but he also said that he had only gone out for a walk with the young lady, and that they were not at all in such a serious relationship as they thought. At the same moment, the young lady also shuddered and said in a puzzled tone that it was so. Syria looked closely at the Marquis, as even in her past life, he was known as a tail twister. She knew that among the great lords, the Marquis was not only the emperor's favorite, but also the most eligible bachelor in the empire. No matter how often he manipulated girls for his own ends, there were many who believed that they were the ones who could win his heart. At that very moment, the Marquis looked at the lady he had found with a predatory grin and said that she had previously rejected him and said that it would be difficult for her to share a meal with him. He looked at her closely and said that he was a little upset because she was spending time in the company of the Archduke at the same time. Syria said with a smirk that he knew that everyone had their own priorities. He looked at her with irritation and wondered if some meeting with the Archduke was really more important than a meal with him. Syria looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. At that very moment, Mark said with a fierce grin that he had thought about marriage. The Archduke could not stand such a question and angrily asked the Marquis how much longer he would have to endure his insolence, and in his rage and anger, he crushed the cup with his bare hands, and it broke. The Archduke was furious as the Marquis not only interfered in their conversation, but also frivolously spoke of a serious matter, such as the union of families. Syria looked anxiously at her companion and asked if everything was all right with him. Cardi asked the Marquis if he understood that he had just insulted the Odolites and Littenheims with such words. the Marquis involuntarily shuddered from such tension and asked who he was insulting, since he only wanted to say hello to the lady. Cardi looked darkly at the Marquis and asked if he would mind if he told the Emperor about today's incident. He understood that even if the Emperor did not care about the insult to the Odalites, if he had problems in his relations with Littenheim, the lords of the south, he could easily lose the Emperor's favor. The Marquis was taken aback by such a statement and looked at the great Archduke with fury. The Marquis, in turn, knew perfectly well that the Archduke would not normally have visited the Emperor for something like this, since the relationship between them had not developed in the best way. However, as last time in everything that concerned the young lady, he became unusual but sensitive. The Marquis smiled and told the young man that he had greatly exaggerated the fact that the Emperor would be angry with him. The Marquis knew there was no need to take any risks, so for now he intended to leave things as they were. He looked at her with a smirk, knowing that the Emperor would most likely be angry with him. Cardi, after making this statement, grabbed the Marquis's hand and asked angrily whether he should not bow properly when saying goodbye to someone. The Marquis looked at the young man with rage and shouted at him to let him go immediately. The Archduke, in turn, was burning with rage and set his brains down that he had said everything that came into his head and even ended the conversation without any manners. Looking at the Marquis, he said that he did not care about the display of rudeness on his part. However, he could not tolerate such behavior towards the young lady. The Marquis looked at the young people with fury and immediately said that they were saying goodbye and wished them a good time. He pulled his hand back and left them in a rage. Cardi looked closely at his companion and asked if she was okay. He was puzzled because he saw the expression on her face. He sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry that she had to see that. But the young lady did not want to listen to him, and at that very moment she screamed and called out. Syria looked at him intently and hurriedly asked if he was okay. He looked at her with bewilderment as he did not understand what she was talking about. Syria screamed and asked if he was hurt, and she took his hand because she wanted to look at his wound. The Archduke was taken aback and sighed heavily and said that his hand was fine. She didn't need to worry. Syria was furious and didn't understand how he could say such a thing since he had just broken a pair with his bare hands. He froze, not knowing what to answer. Syria was furious and asked what would have happened if he had cut himself or if there had been a piece of glass in the hole. The young man couldn't resist laughing. She looked at him in bewilderment as she didn't understand why he was laughing. Cardi looked at his companion sheepishly and said that he appreciated her concern for him. She looked at us intently about his lover because she knew that it was he who helped her stop neglecting herself, because it was he who always put her first. Syria looked at him intently and said that, of course, she would always worry about him. He smiled and asked if that was true. Cardi didn't recall anyone other than the young lady doing anything similar for him. Sometime later, when their walk came to an end, the young lady thanked her companion for bringing her to such a place. Cardi sighed heavily and apologized for having witnessed the unpleasant incident with the Marquis earlier. Syria smiled and asked why he was apologizing for this incident. He was puzzled, as he thought he could have handled this incident in a different way. He said that even though he tried to help her, he couldn't stop thinking that he had behaved inappropriately in the presence of a lady. Syria looked at him with a smile and said that he didn't have to apologize since it wasn't his fault. The only one who should apologize for his rude behavior was the Marquis. Syria looked at the young man with a smile and said that, on the contrary, she was happy that he cared about her. He sighed heavily and said that he really wanted everything to go as well as possible today, and he sincerely wanted her to feel good. The Archduke stated that he rarely went out with anyone, so he might be a little inexperienced today, but he said that if they ever met again, he would try his best to ensure that they had a good time together. Syria looked at her lover with a gentle smile as she saw that this was a rare sight. She did not expect to see her lover being so sincere and talkative. At that very moment, he was taken aback and said that of course he did not insist, but would be very happy if this walk were not the last. She looked at him with a smile and called out. Syria said with a happy smile that since she came to the capital, the time spent with him was the best. The young man froze in place from shock and surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. She smiled and said that he could invite her to meet at any time convenient for him, as she really enjoyed spending her free time with him. He smiled tenderly at her, as he was glad to hear such a thing. But at the same time, he noted that it was the most wonderful day, and after a few seconds, he handed her a small book as a gift. Syria happily thanked him for such a gift. A moment later, she wished him a safe journey. The young man was puzzled. He did not understand when he had such feelings for the young lady. He frightened himself as much as he wanted to make her his. It was his first time dealing with the Marquis, and he was very surprised because he simply could not contain himself when the Marquis approached his companion. He was puzzled, as he was already beginning to get used to the young lady's kindness. He thought for a moment, because earlier she had said that her best memory, after arriving in the capital, was the time spent with him. What had concerned him since he was born? And until now, his most pleasant memory was the short time spent with her. He was glad that he finally met such a beautiful and sweet lady on his way. After some time, Syria read a selection of poems that would suit another person, and she also saw the bookmarks left behind. She knew it was a classic way of expressing feelings that few people used these days. She knew that it was very similar to her beloved, so she did not understand what else was needed for happiness. She thought for a moment and wondered how she could unobtrusively propose to her lover. Syria, in turn, really wanted to marry her beloved again, but she didn't know how to properly propose to him. She knew it hadn't been that long since they first met, so she wondered if it would be weird if she proposed to him right now. She knew that in the past, the emperor had rushed into the engagement, but now was not the time for her. And besides, the young lady began to receive many invitations after her debut in high society. At that very moment, she looked at one of the letters in surprise, as she saw that it was from her brother. She felt like he was waiting for her to contact him. He wrote to her that since she had not yet contacted him, she must have been very busy these days. However, she was the only daughter of the Duke's house. He wanted to hear at least some news from her. Otherwise, his worries would never end. The young lady thought for a moment and felt embarrassed, as after reading the letter, it seemed to her that they were really close brother and sister. She understood that she needed to answer the letter, but at that very moment she was distracted as the maid came to hers. Syria looked at her maid in surprise and asked what had happened because she did not look her best. At that very moment, the maid said that a letter had just arrived. The young lady was taken aback when she saw the seal on this letter. She knew that it was the crest of the imperial family. She knew that the emperor had sent exactly the same letter to summon her in the past. Now she was a little surprised and puzzled, as this letter had arrived much earlier than in her past life. She wondered if this was because she was rushing things. The emperor wrote to the young lady that he had heard that she and the Archduke's delirium had become close recently, and that as his father, he wished to greet her. After reading this letter, the young lady looked at her maid and said that she would soon have to leave. She was puzzled and knew that it was shameless of the emperor, since he didn't even think of Cardi as his son. But she knew that since she was thinking about the wedding, she had no reason to refuse the invitation. She knew that it wasn't such a bad thing to marry in this way. Some time later, the young lady finally met the emperor, and he greeted her with a satisfied smile. She bowed low and introduced herself and greeted him. He threatened and asked the young lady how the Duke had been lately, for he had heard that the Duke had accompanied her to the debutante ball, and he was extremely surprised by this. Looking at the young lady, the emperor noticed that the Duke valued her very much. She smiled but did not answer him. She saw that he behaved differently than in her previous life. She also knew that news of the events during the debutante ball had reached the imperial palace. He smiled and asked if she and the Duke were really on such a warm relationship. The young lady sighed heavily. She realized that she had to be extremely careful with him. She smiled and said that, in fact, there had been no news from him since the end of the debutante ball. The emperor looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Syria knew perfectly well that she shouldn't let him know that they were on good terms with each other. She knew she had to do this if she wanted to marry her lover safely. At that very moment, she said with a smile that she thought her brother was fine, because after all, no news was also good news. She knew what the emperor feared most from their marriage, because the Duke might support the great Archduke because of his younger sister. Syria wanted to show the emperor that this was impossible. She smiled and said that the Duke was indeed a busy man. The emperor thought for a moment, because he did not know whether the rumors were true. The emperor wondered if he and his brother were not close. At that very moment, the emperor looked intently at his young interlocutor and said that the Duke had cruelly punished the Schumacher offspring, and that he was therefore shocked when he learned of the Duke's suspension of the wheat supply. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and informed him that the Duke would not allow anyone to defile the family's honor. She smiled a gentle smile and said that, even though her mother was a commoner, her status as the lady of the family came first. This way, he wouldn't think that Littenheim was treating her coldly. She knew that it would be difficult for her if the emperor didn't recognize her as a worthy partner. She smiled and said that, of course, Compared to the past, her relationship with the Duke had improved. Syria said that since she could be useful to the family in this way, then she should get married. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to marry for love. She said not to worry about such things at all, but she didn't have a suitable man yet. And besides being the daughter of a servant, her origins also had their limits, and she knew that the Duke did not expect much from her marriage. The Emperor looked at her intently, because he knew that, although she was recognized as a noble lady and a duchess, her position was not so high. He understood that she was the ideal option. He knew that her family, the rulers of the South, were the most powerful among the three great houses, and if he could connect the young lady to the imperial family using Cardi, he could take over the entire South. The Emperor understood that this would also solve the problem of finding a partner. He looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that there was no opposition to the young lady being so interested in marriage. At the same moment, he asked if she had got along with Cardis. Syria said a moment later that his lordship was a true gentleman, but the Emperor knew that this was not the case, as he was not very popular in social circles. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had never thought that she was so insightful and wise. At that very moment, he asked with a smile, "How about an alliance with the imperial family?" She was happy because she knew that she had succeeded. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was thinking in the right direction, because he intended to arrange a marriage between her and his son. The Emperor said with a smile that Cardi was his only child prince, and besides, he was also the Archduke of Odalita, one of the three leading houses. He looked at the lady he had found with a smile and said that his son was no less than her family. The young lady was taken aback as she understood that she should not smile in front of the Emperor. He smiled and said that he didn't think it was a bad thing for a lady to lack status. She understood that there was a hidden meaning in that phrase, and in human terms, he was telling her that she was just a servant's daughter with low origins, so she should silently thank him for that. She saw that he, as usual, attacked his interlocutor. She understood that he remained the same as in her past life. Moreover, she saw that he was lying to her, since his relationship with Cardi was not at all like the relationship between a father and a child. At that moment, the young lady drooped and, looking away from the Emperor, said that she had heard a lot about the Archduke's nobility. She knew that it was disgusting on her part, but now she had no choice but to pretend that she was driven into a corner. The Emperor looked at the girl intently because, as he expected, it was quite easy. He found it funny to watch the girl since the Marquise told him that the young lady could become a great problem. Earlier, Mark shouted to the Emperor that the young lady was very smart and knew how to play on the feelings and emotions of other people. But the Emperor now saw just an inexperienced young lady. She sighed heavily and thanked the Emperor for such generous offers. Syria looked at the Emperor with embarrassment and said that, in fact, the decision about her marriage depended only on the Duke, and she could not decide such matters alone. The Emperor understood that if this was all he had to worry about, then it was no problem. He smiled and told the young lady that the Duke would support this marriage union, and the most important thing here was her consent. He understood that Littenheim was a duchy that needed nothing, and if the request was sent to the Duke, he would have no reason to marry the lady to the one who was condemned and surrounded by bad rumors. The Emperor smiled and asked who would say the word "across" if two enthusiastic people had already given their consent. He lived as a gillyflower and said that his son was a war hero with numerous victories, so he would definitely raise the status of the young lady and the status of her family. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really so. The Emperor shouted with a smile that of course it was so. And moreover, if she married Cardi, she would become a respected member of the imperial family. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had been very pathetic in her past life, that she had fallen for such generous tricks on his part. He, like a March cat, told her that her status would skyrocket. The Emperor smiled and said that if she married his son, she would make the greatest contribution to the empire. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Emperor looked at her intently and said grimly that he wished to tell only her this information. He said that his son's incredible strength on the battlefield was inherited from the royal family and came from the bloodline of the late Empress. But this strength was so powerful that it was devouring his son's life force. He said that if she married him, she would become his partner, and in that case, a quick death would be prevented. She was surprised when she heard about the partnership. He smiled and said that his partner would share the burden of Cardi's power equally with him, Syria looked at him coldly as he presented it as if it would serve the country. She was puzzled and did not understand how much greed was in him. He sighed heavily and said that if his son found out, it would be hard for him to accept. She understood that, to be more precise, he was worried that if his son found out, he would be shocked and difficult to control. But in turn, her lady agreed with him. Of course, she also had no intention of telling her lover about such a thing, because she understood that he would refuse her if she became a partner. The emperor smiled and said that in such a case, he would tell her a few conditions before she became a partner. He stated that their relationship as husband and wife should be established through marriage, and she should also be sure of her intention to become his partner. And finally, they must seal the bond with an act of intimacy that only a married couple can share. She froze in place for a moment, in embarrassment, as she already knew all about it, having had the experience of being his partner before. In the past, becoming a legal partner ended with a kiss. She suddenly became embarrassed as memories of their first night came flooding back to her. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment, as her reaction was very interesting, but at the same moment, he said that if this marriage was successful, he would transfer the rights to the iron mines to the duchy. The young lady in turn timidly said that her family would gladly accept this gift, but at the same moment, she said that the partner was sacrificing part of his life, and of course this was not a waste of time and energy, but she would like to ask the emperor for one more favor. The emperor was surprised at the same moment, said that he would do everything, and asked what she wanted. Syria said she wanted to have her own land, to remove the shame of being born a servant, and be recognized as an official member of the imperial family. He looked at her in surprise, but at the same moment asked if it was really a specific land that she wanted. She looked at him with a smile, and said that she would like to get the land of the Magellanic Highlands in the north. After meeting with the emperor, Syria was returning home tired, but nevertheless she managed to get the land that she so desired, and now she understood that this was a great achievement. She knew that the emperor was now smiling from ear to ear. He was amazed that an illegitimate daughter born to a servant dared to insolently point the finger at the imperial family. He was glad that she desired this land, as it was a piece of useless land. In the north, it is known for its mountainous terrain, and the constant appearance of monsters made it one of the most difficult places to live. He understood that she was still ideal for his son, since she was beautiful, but stupid, and also suffered from an inferiority complex due to her origin. The young lady in turn thought for a moment, as she already understood what the emperor thought of her. Everyone wondered why the monsters kept appearing on this land, and the answer was very simple. They did not appear because of the hidden magic in its depths. In her past life, the inhabitants of the north constantly prayed to the imperial cheetah to pacify the troublesome monsters. And eventually, Cardi conquered the land, and then discovered something very interesting. After some time, he noticed a mine with magic stones, and the corpses of the conquered monsters were sold at a high price, and they especially attracted the attention of the Alchemists' Guild. They believed that perhaps, if their corpses were used to fertilize the soil, the resulting plants would become an antidote to the monster's poison. The Alchemists' Guild proposed to conduct an experiment on this land, but the emperor refused, although he could not deny that it was entirely possible. Syria knew that she was very unwell at that time, and at the same time her beloved was cleaning the land. She had nosebleeds from time to time, but they were at the level of fatigue. A sharp deterioration in her health occurred only in the last year of their 10-year marriage. It was when Cardi won over Reyes that she thought her health had deteriorated because of the win. Syria understood perfectly well that there was no point in thinking about this now, because she only needed to wait for a letter from the imperial palace. Some time later, the maid informed her mistress that she had received an engagement letter. The lady was very surprised, and at the same time glad that it had finally arrived. Syria was very happy because she understood that finally, she and her lover could be together. But at that very moment, she froze and wondered if this was really true. She was shocked and puzzled because the Marquis wrote to her that along with the letter he was sending her, a precious stone that reminded him of the color of her eyes. She was shocked because she did not understand why the Marquis suddenly decided to propose to her. The young lady in turn looked closely at the letter and wondered if the Marquis had really sent the dubious and absurd letter to the Duke of Littenheim. She understood that because of what happened at the Marquis's ball, it must be decided that she had secured the Duke's support, and therefore he believed that by marrying her, he would secure the Duke's support. She understood and knew that her brother did not care about her that much, and she didn't expect to become his beloved younger sister. Syria was already deeply grateful, at least for the fact that he did not ignore her existence. However, she understood that her brother would prefer to marry her to a marquis rather than to a great archduke. Because compared to the prince, who was clearly in disfavor with the emperor, spending all his conscious years on the battlefield, the candidacy of the imperial nephew of the emperor's favorite and pretender to the throne looked much more tempting. Sophie looked closely at her mistress and informed the stronger of the marquis that what else awaited her. She sighed heavily and said that she would write an answer later so that she could tell the stronger to return to his master. Sophie said in her mistress that she overheard that, without an urgent answer, the Marquis ordered the man not to return. The young lady in turn was puzzled and did not understand how such a serious matter as a marriage proposal could receive an immediate response. She understood that the Marquis could not even imagine that he would be suddenly rejected. He understood that a lady born a servant would not dare refuse the Marquis's offer. She understood perfectly well that mother and son considered this to be the truth. Syria had no intention of responding to the Marquis, and therefore simply wanted to continue preparing for her wedding with the Grand Archduke. She knew that her family also stood to gain, as they would have iron ore, which in turn was a very successful deal. She knew that the South was undoubtedly famous for its wealth, but nevertheless, all the mines were concentrated in the northern mountains. She knew that the iron mining rights they received would go a long way in supporting the improvement of the southern military in the long run, but she knew that her brother had never been interested in her marriage before. But remembering her past life, she also remembered his tender look, and at the same time, he hoped that they would be happy together. Then in his eyes, she saw only sadness. It seemed to her then that he regretted that his younger sister had married so hastily and left him. She pushed all her thoughts away as she understood that such a thing simply could not be, and she in turn wondered when the letter about the wedding proposal from the palace would arrive. Some time later, Sophie informed her mistress that the Grand Archduke had come to see her. She looked at the lady with alarm and said that the young man said that it was very urgent. Syria froze in place for a moment in surprise, as she didn't expect him to arrive so quickly. The young man in turn was a little cold and in no mood. After some time, he finally met with his companion and asked for forgiveness for not having informed her of his visit in advance. Syria looked at the young man with a smile and said that everything was fine and that he did not need to worry, as she believed that there was a good reason for it. At the same moment, she asked with a smile what brought him to her. Cardi looked away in his direction, not knowing how to start the conversation. He said he heard that she had a private audience at the Imperial Palace a few days ago. She looked at him closely and said that it was not at all what it seemed at first glance, because she agreed to this marriage, because that was her desire. Syria informed her companion that they would be serving tea soon so they could calm down a bit and talk in the living room. Some time later, they sat quietly in the living room while the maid served. He looked at her intently and asked her to think it over again. Cardi couldn't understand how a young and beautiful lady could have such an unprofitable marriage. He said that she didn't need it at all. He looked at her intently and said that he was forbidden from having that kind of relationship and had no right to marry. She looked at him in surprise. There was a reason why he said such things. She was furious, and since she tried very hard to meet him again. And at that very moment, she realized that he had no idea what she felt. Cardi sighed heavily and told his companion that he would never be able to make her happy, because until now, every time he considered someone dear to him, that person disappeared in the blink of an eye. He knew that the young lady was the only one who had shown warmth to him lately. He knew she simply couldn't be married to someone like him, because even his dearly beloved mother, the only person who truly loved him, lost her life because of him, and this fact was destroying him from the inside. After the empire conquered Reyes, his mother was captured and forced to become empress. Every time she burst into bitter tears when she saw her beloved son, she cried quietly and told him that she hated this land and she did not want to live on it at all. It was then that he realized that he had to protect his mother. But no matter how many times he went to the battlefield to protect her in the end, he could not protect her. Cardi sighed and said the young lady didn't know anything. He said, puzzled, that he was the emperor's dog and that he was raised as a monster by the emperor himself, because the power he inherited from Reyes was so great that it could determine the outcome of the war. However, this power never made him happy. At that very moment, the young lady took her beloved's hand and asked him not to belittle himself like that. She looked at him intently and said in all seriousness that he was only doing his duty and obligations. Syria said that until now, he had participated in countless wars, following the orders of the imperial family, but he no longer had a reason to live like that. She said that from this moment on, he should live as her beloved husband. The young man sat at the table with his onion in place, as he did not expect such words. Cardi froze for a moment when he heard that he was going to be Syria's future husband. Syria looked at the young man intently and called out to him. He flinched as if he had thrown all his thoughts away. She said that he who does not respect himself cannot be respected by others. She told him the same thing that he told her in her past life. She said that he was not at all like a monster, since he was a completely ordinary person who deserved happiness. She was able to change thanks to her lover, so in this life she had to repay him in the same way. She smiled and said that he would be her husband in the future. He was a little puzzled because he saw her steadfastness. He saw the warmth in her eyes, so he couldn't refuse her. But at that very moment, he said that he thought the emperor had insisted on this marriage only in order to use him and control her family. He was angry with himself because he knew that this was not the answer he wanted to give her. Cardi said he couldn't let the young lady take that risk for him. He said he was of course aware of the issue too. At that very moment, she smiled happily and asked if he also knew how much the emperor wanted to get her family. The young man was taken aback and asked if she really knew that such a threat existed. He did not understand why she followed the emperor's lead. She smiled and said that it was because she knew that the duke was no pushover and that the duke knew his position and his duties better than anyone else. Syria asked with a smile if the South had ever been broken by an emperor in its entire history. The young man could not answer her question. Cardi said he was not trying to discredit Duke's competence. He hesitated, not knowing what to answer the young lady. Syria looked closely at her companion, as she could see his excitement. She saw the expression of one who had no self-respect. At the end of their life together, before her return, when death was approaching her every minute, Cardi once told her that he was afraid to keep her near. After all, he never made those he loved happy. Then she felt the desperation in his words. She didn't want him to experience such feelings again. Syria decided that she would not allow the past to repeat itself. She knew that, to do this, she had no choice but to resort to her old tricks. She looked away from him and said sadly and timidly that she knew what he was trying to say by this. At that very moment, she stood up and asked if he really hated her. The young man was taken aback because he did not understand why she suddenly thought in such a way. She said that it was all because she personally had no complaints about marrying him, since previously he had only insisted that he couldn't do it. Cardi was confused and asked the young lady to calm down and not think like that. At that very moment, she said that, for his information, she had other engagement proposals. He flinched as he was surprised by such a statement and asked angrily from whom she received the proposal. She said she had received an offer from the Marquis. Looking away from the Grand Duke, she said that if he refused their marriage, she would have no choice but to marry the Marquis. The Duke asked angrily if this meant that the Marquis had already entered into marriage negotiations with the young lady. She asked if he really preferred that she marry the Marquis. He asked angrily if he had said that he wanted this. At that moment, he looked away from her in embarrassment and asked for forgiveness for carelessly raising his voice. He was a little taken aback because he didn't think he would lose his composure. Syria had a rather similar reaction to her from the young man, because she did not respond to the Marquis' proposal from the very beginning in order to persuade the Archduke in this way. The Archduke was furious because for a second he imagined that she might actually marry the Marquis. The vague thought that he could make her unhappy evaporated in an instant. He sighed heavily and said that he just thought that he might disappoint her if she married him. He sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that this was what he feared most of all. She looked at him with a tender smile and said that this would never happen, so he didn't need to worry so much. She knew it was so because even her past life didn't matter. No matter what happened, her marriage was filled with happiness. She looked at her lover with a tender smile because she knew that marriage with him was the best thing that could happen in her life. At that very moment, the young man could not bear it any longer and knelt down in front of his beloved. He must have sighed and, looking into her eyes, said that he still had no confidence. She froze for a moment and her heart started beating wildly as she saw how beautiful he was. He said he would do everything in his power to make her happy, and at that very moment, he asked her if she would marry him. Syria looked at him with tenderness, as she was glad that she could achieve such a thing. At that very moment, she happily said that she agreed. Cardi looked at his companion with a satisfied smile after she agreed, for even without any flower decorations or sweet words, he proposed to her, and she knew that there was no more perfect proposal than this. She was glad that she was finally able to receive a proposal from her beloved, because she understood that in this life she could be with him. She knew that now all that remained was to successfully conduct the wedding ceremony. That was what she thought. But there was one small problem because the Duke was furious. He did not understand how she could start talking about the wedding without saying a word to him. He was burning with anger and fury, since her companion was the great Archduke himself. Her brother returned to the capital as soon as he heard the news. He shouted that he knew that this marriage was built only for political value. Trembling with fear, she said that she was very sorry. She said that she understood his fears very well, and she could not have imagined that he would make such a long journey back to the capital because of her. With tears in her eyes, the young lady said that she was sorry to have disturbed such a busy man like him, and she, however, had nothing to say in her defense. She simply quietly apologized. She didn't argue that it wasn't her fault, so she apologized to him several times. Syria couldn't believe at all that he had left all his business in the south just to come all the way to the capital and scold her. She knew it was very strange because her brother hadn't been angry about her marriage in her past life. He sighed heavily and looked closely at his sister as she still called him by his title. He didn't understand when she would address him as an older brother, and the young lady in turn was puzzled as she understood that this was a very awkward situation. He looked at her intently and said that she had never once called him big brother. She looked at him in bewilderment, and at that very moment said that it was all because she was an illegitimate child. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked what was wrong with Togo Syria, sighed heavily, and said that she could never compare to the Duke's real sister. He looked at her intently and asked if he had ever said such words to her. The Duke asked if he had said that she was an illegitimate child or not his younger sister. He looked at the young lady intently and asked firmly if he had ever told her not to call him big brother. She froze for a moment, not expecting such questions. Now that she thought about it, even in her past life, the Duke had never called her illegitimate. She thought that he took taking care of her for granted, like helping the family. She knew it was all true, and he had never said such words to her. She assumed he had always accepted her as part of the family. That's why she was the first to draw a rough line between them. Now she understood the meaning of the words, to swallow one's tongue. She bowed and said that everything was correct, and he had never said such words to her before. Ernan sighed heavily and said that revealing her feelings to the person she likes and living a happy life together in the aftermath is of course wonderful. However, he looked at her closely and asked if she had thought about whether she would be happy in this marriage. She assumed that her brother was a rather calm person, and she would never have guessed that it would cause such a stir. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she was his only younger sister. He sighed heavily and said that as her older brother, he sincerely wished her happiness. He looked at her closely and said with concern that he did not want her to become a victim of a political marriage. Ernan told his sister that for this reason, if she had accepted this marriage because of the rights to the iron mines, she might as well just give up this crazy idea now. He said that they are the leaders of the South, and besides, he is a great lord of the empire. He said that he is not so poor as to sell his only younger sister in order to get the rights to some mines. Ernan said that in addition, her fiancé was none other than the Archduke himself, with a reputation as a terrifying monster. He did not want to marry her to such a monster and rumors. She of course was touched by his concern, but she understood that this was going beyond all bounds. Syria looked at her brother with a smile and said that, in reality, everything was not as he imagined, and she also said that she felt a strong attraction to the Archduke. She looked at her brother intently and said with her gentle smile that she wanted him to be her husband and no one else. The Duke looked at his sister intently and, denying reality, said that this marriage would not bring her any benefit. She smiled and said that she really liked the young man. He was furious and did not understand what had come over her and why she had fallen in love with the Archduke himself. He shouted that she was the only lady of the Duke's great family, and besides, she was of beautiful appearance. He shouted that she was a real beauty and could find someone else since she had no flaws at all. He shouted that he was going to carefully choose a groom for her and would take care of everything himself. At that very moment, he froze in place because he remembered their first meeting, and now he realized that this was not groundless excitement, because then he felt something was wrong at their first meeting, because then they looked at each other with admiration. The Duke sighed heavily as he realized that all was lost. He agreed with anger in his voice. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect him to agree so quickly. He looked at her darkly and said that since she said so, he thought he should meet with the Duke in person. She was shocked and scared, as she did not understand what he was going to tell her beloved. At that very moment, he shouted and called her. She was taken aback, because she had not expected such a thing. But he shouted that, from now on, if she wanted to go somewhere, she must definitely warn him. The Duke shouted that since she had a wedding planned for the future, they would have to contact each other more often. She was taken aback and shouted that she was truly sorry and that she agreed to everything. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if she knew how worried he had been while in the duchy. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. He said with sadness in his voice that he left his little sister alone. She understood that she could not argue with him because he said everything correctly. She was pleased that he spoke such words to her, and at that very moment she said with a tender smile that she was really sorry. He looked away from her and said that he did not want her to be so carefree. Surya looked at her brother. She didn't even know that he was the type to worry so much about his little sister. She looked at her brother with tenderness, as she now learned many new sides of the Grand Duke and her lover. He looked at her with bewilderment, asked why she was smiling like that. She looked at him with a smile in response, and said that nothing special, she was just in a good mood. She was glad that she returned to the past. A few days after her invitation, her lover came to their duchy. She greeted him with a smile, and he responded with a joyful greeting. He smiled and said that he thought she would like this dessert, so he took it with him. Surya was delighted because he brought her a roll and cookies. She was happy because he brought gifts every time he came. She expected nothing else from his sincerity. At that very moment, he bowed and said that he had heard that the Duke wanted to meet with one in person. She began to speak, but at that very moment, the Duke interrupted her and called the young man. Cardi bowed and told the Duke that he was sorry he had kept him waiting so long. Surya. The young lady was frightened by her brother's statement. She immediately shouted that they had wonderful rolls and cookies. She asked if he would like to sit at the table and have a cup of tea with a wonderful dessert. He saw that she even neglected her only brother for the sake of the young man. He was angry and did not understand why she still addressed him formally, and the young lady was a little puzzled as she saw that her brother had become even angrier. Cardi looked at his beloved with a tender smile and said that everything would be fine and she didn't need to worry. Some time later, they moved into a new room and a dead silence hung between them. Now the young man understood what it meant to sit on thorns. He looked at the Duke intently, for he supposed that he had many thoughts in his head, but he understood him perfectly well, for he knew that it was not at all pleasant to see the man who would soon take away his precious sister. He understood the Duke, since he had to give his sister to a man whom the people called a monster. The Duke sighed heavily, and nevertheless called the young man. At that very moment, he asked if he would like a drink. Cardi looked at the Duke in surprise, as he had not expected anything like this at all. He sighed heavily and said that since his father died, this was the first time he was going to have a drink. Cardi looked closely at the young man and said that he understood him perfectly. The Duke said he believed the young man knew his father was not a very good man. Cardi looked at the Duke intently, not knowing what to answer at all, since the rumor of the previous Duke's notorious reputation had reached his ears. Apart from his affairs with his own wife's maids, he had committed many inappropriate acts, and the word vulgar was the best description for him. Ernan sighed heavily and said that when he received the title of Duke, a whole mountain of work fell on him, and he had not been shoveling it out of Togo for many years. And in just 5 years, Yuga had become powerful with land that no one dared to covet. Unfortunately, he couldn't spend much time with his sister, but once he became a duke, she was officially recognized as a member of the family. At the time, he believed that declaring the illegitimate child, as she considered herself an official member of the family, was all he could do for her. After that, he forgot about her for a while. Ernan sighed heavily and said that he ended up being the one who neglected his little sister for many years. He looked at the young man intently and said with a bitter smile that he admitted that he did not deserve to be called her older brother. The Archduke was a little puzzled. He understood that it was extremely difficult to choose the right words at such a moment. He saw that right now, the Duke looked terribly tired. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was still angry when she said that she would accept the marriage proposal as she pleased. He said that it was ridiculous because he never fulfilled his duty as an older brother, but acted as if he had the right to interfere in her affairs. Cardi looked closely at the young man and asked him not to drink too much. Duke said that he took it in order. He did not need to worry since he could drink only now. Cardi apologized to the Duke and said he believed he was not happy with the marriage. He asked the Duke if he was simply worried about him. Cardi said he knew he didn't like it at all. Before he could finish speaking, the Duke asked if he could be honest with him. He said it's not that he doesn't like him. He just doesn't like any man who wants to marry his sister. Cardi froze in place at the dude, as he didn't expect to hear that. Ernan shouted that his sister was already leaving the Duke of Togo to marry some man, and she was still young. Cardi raised that the young lady was already of the right age for marriage. But he did not want to argue with the Duke. The Duke cried out in rage that he had not taken proper care of her before, and that having been born illegitimate, she had been constantly subjected to persecution. He was furious because it was to the point that when she was younger, she was treated like a servant. Cardi was very angry because he knew about the lady's sad past as an illegitimate child and the rumors, but he knew that she was still the Duke's daughter and she was treated like a servant. The Duke was furious because he knew he should have protected her, but he failed to do so. He was unable to do anything at that time, as he was also subjected to persecution. His father was burning with rage and anger because he believed that his son was stupid and would not be able to take the place of the Duke. He beat him every time and shouted at him to sit quietly in his room until he learned everything. He was also very afraid of his father, but now he realized that these were just excuses. He said that maybe it was selfish on his part, and he was trying to absolve himself of his own guilt, but he really was going to do everything he could to make his sister happy. But suddenly, out of the blue, she decided to leave him to marry some stranger. He told the young man that he had to understand something about the despair he felt in this current situation. He looked at us intently at the great Archduke and said that if he was sure of his desire and wanted to take his sister's fish, he must make her truly happy. The Duke looked intently at the young man, expecting a positive answer from him. Cardi immediately said that he would certainly do it, and he intended to do everything in his power to make the lady happy. The Duke smiled tenderly at the young man and said that in that case, he could rest easy. Sometime later, the young lady bumped into her lover in the corridor and asked in an anxious voice if everything was okay with him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had been waiting for him all this time. She timidly asked if her brother had been rude to him. He smiled and said that it was quite the opposite, because the Duke had told him many good things. The young man fixed his gaze on the young lady and timidly said that the Duke was very drunk. He said that he thought it would be better to call a servant to carry him to the rooms. The young lady was shocked and wondered if her brother was drunk, as nothing like this had ever happened before. Sometime later, she saw her brother, who was very drunk. She was shocked and couldn't believe that she saw her brother, who got drunk and passed out. Cardi quietly told his beloved that all this time the Duke had been doing was worrying about her. She looked at him in surprise, still not understanding what he was talking about. Cardi smiled and told his beloved that the Duke said that his sister should definitely be happy. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that she had a wonderful older brother. She had always believed that their relationship was more like that of a head of a house and a bastard than that of a brother and sister. And all these years she had continued to believe it, and at the same time she had built walls and drawn lines between them. But now she realized how stupid she had been. She looked closely at her brother, as she knew that because of the one who had returned to the past, he was younger than her. She didn't understand why in the past she had treated him with respect, but at the same time found him intimidating. She saw that her brother was very young, but he already carried on his shoulders the heavy burden of being the head of the family and took care of her as well. The next day, the young man woke up with a terrible headache. He was very angry because his head was bursting with a hangover. He was puzzled and did not understand. When he fell asleep sighing heavily, he asked someone to bring him water. Ernan asked in bewilderment what she was doing in his room anyway. She smiled and said that the great Archduke had decided to visit them again today, and she told him that they simply had to enjoy tea together with the roll he had brought yesterday. The Duke looked at his sister with surprise and irritation and asked if she had not met the Archduke yesterday. She looked closely at her brother and said that the Archduke had a meeting yesterday, not with her. The Duke irritably asked his sister if she really liked the young man so much. She smiled and said that she liked him very much. The Duke was furious, and at that very moment, he drank the entire infusion in one gulp. She was shocked and shouted at him to drink the infusion more slowly. At that moment, she sighed heavily and said that she wanted to ask if he would like to join them. But looking at her brother, she understood that this would be too much, because his condition was not the best. She said that she would bring him some hot broth right now. He sighed heavily and thanked her. As she left, the young lady looked at her brother closely and asked him not to drink anymore. so he sighed heavily and said that he would be careful in the future. She said that she did not want to see her only brother suffering from a hangover again. At that very moment, the young man jumped up and sat on the bed, as he was surprised by her words. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she could call him brother. Without thinking, he said that she could certainly call him that, and he also called her. Ernan looked at her intently and timidly said that they should send each other letters more often. He said that once she got married, it would be difficult to keep in touch, and it was the same now. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he shouldn't say that. After all, even being married, she intended to write to him as often as possible. She looked at him with a snowy smile, and leaving said that she didn't want him to get bored without her. He smiled and said that it would be good. Some time later, she met the Grand Duke, who received her as his guest. He looked at her timidly and called out. He said that since the emperor was in such a hurry to marry them, he had not had time to properly observe all the conditions for a marriage proposal. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. At that very moment, he said that he wanted to give her something. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not know what he was going to give her. But at that very moment, a maid approached them and timidly said that someone had passionately wanted to see the young lady. Syria was furious, since a very important moment had been ruined for her. She smiled, as she did not at all remember waiting for someone at such a time. She looked closely at the maid and said that at the moment, she was spending time with the great Archduke. She was furious, did not understand who suddenly needed to meet with her. The maid was taken aback and said that she was sorry. She said in a trembling voice that the Marquise was now standing at the threshold, and her eyes were burning with rage and malice. And at the same time, the servants tried to calm her down, but all to no avail. Syria was surprised, as the Marquise had suddenly appeared, whenever she felt like it, and had caused a commotion. She asked the maid if the Marquise had told the reason for her anger. Sophie froze for a moment, unsure how to respond, her voice trembling and tears welling up in her eyes. At that very moment, gathering her courage, she said that the Marquise considered the young lady's refusal to the Marquis insultings. At that very moment, the Duke entered the room and said angrily that he had heard something absurd. Syria looked at her brother in surprise, as she didn't understand why he wasn't sleeping in such a state. The Duke looked closely at the servants and asked where the Marquise was now, and also told them to convey that he would personally see her. The young lady immediately shouted that she also intended to go with him. Syria understood that if her brother went alone, there would be problems. She shouted to her brother, but he did not stop. Syria was shocked as she saw her brother disappear as if by the wind. She turned quickly to her lover and asked what they should do about it. The young man in turn sipped his tea with bliss and with a gentle smile asked what she was talking about. She was shocked and did not understand why he was so calm. She was very worried as she understood that at this rate a conflict could arise between the Marquise and the Duke. At that very moment, the Madame screamed with rage because she could not believe that the girl dared to reject her son's proposal, and at the same time, she did not even intend to show herself. She screamed and asked if the lady was really demonstrating her influence, like a lady at home. She was angry because the young lady left her outside the gate. She did not understand how such disrespect could be shown. At that very moment, the Duke came out to Madame and called her. He said that he assumed her bad reputation as the Emperor's younger sister was a thing of the past. Looking at her, he said with rage and anger that it seemed he was mistaken. Before she married the Marquis, her authority as an imperial princess, not from Togo, had suffered as the story of how she had spilled tea on the envoy of another country was still being discussed by aristocrats. She looked at him with fury and asked where his manner was, or had he already forgotten that Anna was many years older than him. She was furious because she did not know that the Duke was at your estate, but she understood that it didn't even matter because he was still not mature. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and said that she had come to discuss the pressing issue with the young lady. He looked at her with a smirk and said that coming to them and expressing her dissatisfaction with the fact that his younger sister refused to marry her son was not a pressing issue at all, but simply childishness on her part. The Marquise was shocked by his words. He looked at her with a grin and asked if the man who had come to them without an invitation had remembered his manners. She screamed furiously that this was an urgent conversation. He sighed heavily as he realized that he had not had such a conflict for a long time. After all, after he took the title of Duke, everyone considered it necessary to point a finger at the fact that he was too young because he was still young, he was inexperienced. He was always told that his knowledge was not complete, But he took care of this because no matter what status he had no other arguments. Besides the difference in age, and being the Lord of the South and his sister's elder brother, he did not want to endure such a thing again. At that moment, he sighed heavily and called the Marquise. At that very moment, the Duke looked coldly and angrily at Madame and asked if she really considered his family to be easy money. He said that earlier, she said that his sister was the only Duchess, and at the same time, she rejected her son's proposal. He smiled a predatory grin and said that everything was correct because he heard these very words from the mouth of the Marquise. But at the same time, he said that he did not at all understand her indignation and the fury of her discontent. He asked if it would not be better for her to discuss this matter personally with the emperor. She was taken aback for a moment as she saw that the brother and sister were alike. The Marquise angrily asked the young man if he really wanted to disturb the emperor with such an insignificant matter. The Duke was astonished when she called it an insignificant matter. At the same moment, he asked if she really thought that insulting his family was an insignificant matter.